Welcome to the Sunday discussion, everybody. Um, Good to have you guys with me here. We're going to talk today about Alan Watts. Um, I'm assuming that all three of you know who Alan Watts is already. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go a bit over his biography, his history, how he got into this stuff, where he started, and then I'm also going to share some of my favorite stories of his that I particularly like. And if you guys have some stories you like that he shares as well that I don't mention, definitely feel free to jump in and um, yeah, so the main idea that I'd like to focus on is the concept of the jester, which was, I think, a more unique idea that Alan had. Um, it's not something that I hear talked about much, and a lot of speakers like Alan, sometimes you think they're just repeating other teachers or they're repeating what they've read, but I really think that the Joker was among one of his most original concepts in terms of interpreting a lot of this stuff. So, we'll start at the beginning. Alan Watts was born January 6th, 1915, near London. He grew up as a Christian. His grandfather was a missionary. His mother was very religious as well and raised him to pretty much be a believer. He was also raised with a fascination and interest in stories, fables, and tales from the quote unquote mysterious Far East. His mother would have different kinds of Eastern art around the house that he just was completely enraptured by. Um, he got really sick with a fever when he was a child, and he wrote in a later book about this experience where he had a mystical dream while he was uh, deep into this fever. And he had already been very interested in landscape paintings and embroideries that his mother had from the Far East. And um, in this fever, he seemed to see this art with a certain clarity and transparency. It seemed to float for him. Uh, and this ended up obviously deeply influencing him in terms of the relationship of people and nature, spaciousness, emptiness, that light floating sensation that he got in that moment seemed to really carry with him. By contrast, he was sent to a Christian boarding school starting when he was about 7.5. He described them as grim and maudlin. He uh, really hated the strictness of it, the ritual floggings, tasteless food, binding uniforms. He mentions this in many of his talks, just in terms of analogy, but this is what he directly experienced. He said that British food and clothing was, uh, pale and boring and distasteful, boiled beef and such. So he was at the school weekly. Um, he he also missed the company of girls while he was at this school. He longed for an authentic mentor or authority figure that wasn't just cramming learning into his head. He liked the light touch. He wanted someone who had a very light uh, way of teaching. And I guess that comes from a lot of that lightness and space in that art he was so drawn to. Um, so he maintained a very heavy distrust of um, disciplined approach to life and rigorous kind of structure. It's part of why he ended up rejecting Christianity later on, and a lot of it probably did come from his experiences in British boarding schools, a la Pink Floyd. Um, he was alienated by a lot of his surroundings and the people he was around. He was a scholarship student, which a lot of the other kids didn't like. He was very solitary. He read on his own all the time, and he was disgusted with the narrowness of Christianity even as a child. Um, by the time he became a teenager, he was spending holidays in France with a friend of his who was into Buddhism and started to get him into it as well. And he ended up joining the London Buddhist Lodge. He actually even became their secretary at 16 years old in 1931. And I think he started going there at about 14. So he started this interest pretty early, and starting at about 14, 15, he began to practice a lot of different styles of meditation. He was experimenting, trying to see what worked and what didn't. Um, he did really well in school and high school, but he had a chance for a scholarship to Oxford, and he completely blew it by writing an essay that was considered presumptuous and capricious. Um, and so I like to think of him as like this kind of rebel teen that's like, I don't even need this scholarship to Oxford. If they can't see my real point, they don't deserve me, kind of a thing. Um, so he didn't go to college. He worked at a printing house after high school and then a bank, and he spent most of his time at the Buddhist Lodge. And he was self-teaching. He's considered an autodidact by most of his biographers, which basically means completely self-taught. He was reading widely in philosophy, history, psychology, psychiatry, and of course, Eastern thought. Um, he would reach out to contact other spiritual authors of the time in correspondence. Um, at 21 in 1936, he attended the World Congress of Faiths and heard D.T. Suzuki speak. D.T. Suzuki was a Zen master who was very popular in the West because he was one of the first Zen teachers to start to try to bridge that gap and introduce Eastern thought to the West. Um, he was even able to meet D.T. Suzuki after this conference, which obviously heavily influenced him. He talks a lot about Suzuki in his later speeches and lectures. So this was 1936 when this happened, and throughout the 1930s is when he really started getting into Zen. He published The Spirit of Zen, A Way of Life, Working and Art in the Far East in 1936. And I believe it was his first book at 21 years old. So he wrote this book the same year he met Suzuki about the spirit of Zen. He later disparaged it as being unscholarly and outdated and misleading and just really a popularization of what Suzuki was saying. But that came later, and that was his own criticism. He married his first wife around this time. I believe they got married in 1938. Her name was Eleanor Everett, and then in 1938 they also left England to come to the United States. He became a U.S. citizen in 1943, which, if you can imagine what Europe was like at the time, that was probably pretty heavily influenced by World War II. His father-in-law, his wife's father, was actually a Zen master. It wasn't his wife's biological father, it was her stepdad. But he was a Zen master, I forget his name, and he was a big mentor to Watts and helped him through a lot of this stuff in the later 1930s. He had 2 daughters with Eleanor. So they lived in New York for a time, and he did do some formal Zen training in New York, but he decided to leave that, and there was something about the training he didn't like, and he actually entered the Seabury Western Theological Seminary, which is a school in Illinois. It's an Episcopal school. And at this school, he studied Christian scriptures, theology, history. He was still very heavily influenced by Christianity, and his wife was very Christian as well. He was attempting to make a blend of contemporary Christian worship, mystical Christianity, and Asian philosophy. He was actually awarded an honorary master's degree in theology for his thesis, which was called Behold the Spirit, a study in the necessity of mystical religion. Um, he was ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1945 at the age of 30. And 5 years later, by 1950, he resigned the ministry. This was partly because he had an affair and his wife had their marriage annulled, but also partly because he found he couldn't reconcile his Buddhist Zen beliefs with the doctrine of the church. Um, and so I actually pulled up his resignation letter to the church. He wrote out why he was leaving, and I wanted to go over it a bit because it's just so good, and it's really about him beginning the journey of becoming the man we are familiar with, and saying his final goodbye to Christianity. Um, so he says in the letter that he first became a minister because he was seeking refuge of the confusion of our times by giving in to nostalgia of tradition and Christian doctrine. And he said that Christianity does contain the most profound truth, but that it has lost meaning to people. And this is where he starts to sound a lot like Nietzsche in our previous talk. He said, the language is archaic. This is just an imitation of faith. When forms of belief, like all other finite things, begin to die, the effort to revive them is just imitation. These forms of belief are perishing because the spirit within them is breaking as a bird breaks from its shell. He believed that we live in Kali Yuga, which is a Hindu term for this disintegration and iconoclasm, this sense of why has God forsaken me, this turbulent time that we all lived in. And this is 1950, so this is post-World War II, a lot of McCarthyism going on, especially in the United States, which is where he lived then, and he was in Illinois at the time too. He said, this time is a prelude to resurrection. Forms are transient and a permanent form is not God. And to grasp and cling to these forms is to kill them, like you would if you tried to cling to a life form. So I have a quote here from the Bible, from Jesus, and he says, "It is expedient for you that I go away. For if I go not away, the Paraclete cannot come to you." And the Paraclete is a Holy Spirit as an advocate or counselor. So basically, Jesus was saying, I have to go away because if I don't, you're not going to get it. And he said the same thing to Mary Magdalene. He said, do not cling to me. And Watts mentions both of these in his letter. He says, we've made Christ an idol, which must be destroyed in his own name. The church is clinging to authority and therefore clinging to its own death. And people are seeking to escape from their inner emptiness and insecurity, the transiency and uncertainty of human life. And it's not evil that life flows or changes or passes away. It is a revelation that prevents us from clinging to ourselves. And whoever lets go of himself finds God. Whoever, this is another quote from the Bible, whosoever would save his soul shall lose it. And this is so fundamental in Buddhism, and this is a theme that I've been thinking a lot about lately as well, which is the seeking of all of this is what keeps you from it. He says this a bit later. This is a quote from Alan Watts, "Let go. You will only find God if you do not try to possess him." The moralism which condemns a man for not loving is simply adding strength to that sense of fear and insecurity which prevents him from loving. And he believed this was fundamental. People were seeking Christianity because they were insecure and they were running from that, and that we must understand and accept fear and uncertainty. And this eventually evolved into his concept of the wisdom of insecurity, which I think most of us are probably familiar with him talking about this. he does say he's not expecting the church to be perfect. Spiritual perfection is not what he's looking for. He's just saying that um, what he sees is just illusions, and he cannot conform to this way of life anymore because he cannot pretend and he cannot imitate anymore. He understands worship as an expression of joy or thanksgiving, but not as a moral uh, discipline, and that he said, and this is a fundamental thing that he talks about many times later in his life, he said that the idea of improving yourself is absurd because it's based on the illusion that there is an I that has to do the improving, and then there's a me that must be improved. And this is just yourself chasing yourself. And how are you supposed to improve yourself when you're the one that also needs it? And here's another quote from his letter. For where the actual possibility of I loving me is seen to be an illusion, the vicious circle is broken, and there remains only that outflowing love which is called God. He didn't want to lead people from the church with this letter. He specifically says, don't follow me, don't follow others, only follow yourself. And his very last paragraph I thought was pretty nice. He says, I expect now to devote most of my time to writing and lecturing, not because I wish to make converts, but because I love this work more than any other, because it enables me to live and take care of my family, and because I believe I have something to say which is worth saying. And that's where his letter ends. So, pretty powerful step away from the church for him, and he did make it public in that way too, and he made it meaningful instead of just leaving. So that was in 1950. He spent a little bit more time in New York. After that, he married again in New York before moving, actually, and he married Dorothy DeWitt and had 5 children with her. He also met John Cage around this time in New York and would hang out with him. John Cage was a musician who famously would have people come to a concert and have all of the instruments set up and all of the music ready to go, and then would just play silence. And I can imagine that Alan Watts was very drawn to that idea. So he moved to California in 1951 with his wife. He joined faculty at the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, and he taught there from 1951 to 1957. He met a poet there named Jean Burden, and had a 4-year love affair with her. He credits her as a huge influence on his life. He dedicated the book Nature, Man and Woman to her, which was published in 1958. And in this book, he talks a lot about psychedelics. Obviously, he's in San Francisco, and he's interested in Buddhism, and it's the mid-late 1950s. This is the beatnik era, so he stumbled into LSD. And in 1958, he took LSD several times. His first time tripping was on mescaline. He was actually taking LSD with research teams at some of the schools there. So I don't know if Tim Leary was involved in that. I think he was at a different California school, but he was working with professors who were doing actual research studies and taking LSD, and he also tried weed. I don't think he liked weed as much. He said it was a useful and interesting psychoactive drug. Later on about psychedelics, he says very clearly, if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments, like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. The biologist does not sit with eye permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. And so he had a big theory that, and he talks about it in the book Nature, Man and Woman, that psychedelics can be extremely useful, but once you get that message, hang up the phone. Don't get lost in just taking them over and over, which I think is very poignant. He became an administrator at the Academy of Asian Studies. In 1953, he He started a radio program at Pacifica Radio Station in Berkeley. This is one of his most famous programs and how he really started to get famous. He wasn't paid for it at all. He did it for free, and he did that until 1962. And at that point, he had attracted a lot of regular listeners um, and people who knew his name. He continued to give live talks and seminars during this time, which were recorded and were broadcast on these same radio stations. And a lot of these lectures were what we are familiar with now. In 1957, at 42 years old, he published his most famous book, which was called The Way of Zen. It focused on the philosophical explanation and history of Zen. He was trying to put it in a very accessible way for Westerners to be able to understand. He also talks a lot about general semantics, cybernetics. He uses modern technology and cybernetics as analogies in this book. So he was trying to bridge a lot of modern culture into this as well. In 1958, he took a tour in Europe doing a lot of these lectures, and this is where he met Carl Jung, who he had admired for a long time and read a lot about. He came back to the US and started to do 2 seasons of a TV series that ran from 1958 to 1960 for KQED, which was a public TV station in San Francisco. And the title of the TV show was called Eastern Wisdom and Modern Life. In the early 1960s, he separated from his wife after he met Mary Jane Yates King, who he married in 1964 and spent the remainder of his life with her. He mostly lived with her on a houseboat or in a secluded cabin in Druid Heights, California. Druid Heights was kind of a communal space. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute here. He became a professor of comparative philosophy at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he also had a fellowship at Harvard from 1962 to 64, and was a scholar at San Jose State University in 1968. So he had a lot of different experience with being a professor and teaching and lecturing to students, and that was really a lot of his passion. He was questioned sharply by his students during a talk at UC Santa Cruz in 1970, and they were philosophy students who were trying to say, oh, you're getting this or that wrong. And he said that he was not an academic philosopher, but rather a philosophical entertainer. And this is something we've heard a lot repeated in his talks, where he says, what I'm doing is entertainment. It's not meant to be an accurate, serious study, because he really didn't take it that seriously. So he was a pretty big part of the scene in California. He was friends with Gary Snyder, who was a poet. He was friends with Robert Anton Wilson, who was a writer. He often blended a lot of his writing with modern science and psychology. He was fascinated with these two things. He would find parallels between mystical experience and scientific theories of the material world. And he was doing this in the 50s and 60s when a lot of people still hadn't really done this. He also really believed in applied aesthetics, which, to look at that houseboat, you wouldn't think that. He believed that aesthetics were something that would make people's lives better. So having more beautiful architecture, more beautiful landscapes, more fine art, fine cuisine. He thought a cultural renewal was necessary for American culture. And coming out of the 1950s, I can imagine why he thought that way. He believed that there was an alienation that comes with being human, and that this plagued the modern Westerner. And like Aldous Huxley, who was another contemporary of his, he was seeking to lessen the ill will that was an unintentional byproduct of alienation from the natural world. He also believed in and talked a lot about the divineness within sex and love. He believed in something called Mythuna, which Huxley also talks about, and he wrote about it a few years before Huxley's last book, The Island, which also talks about it. And it's basically the idea of divine coupling, of turning sex and love into a kind of spiritual practice. Um, Alan referred to himself as a Zenist in spirit. He understood that he wasn't a strict practitioner. Um, he also became really interested in Taoism and Hinduism. His last book was called Tao, the Watercourse Way, and that's what he was writing at the time of his death. He also spoke a lot about Hinduism scriptures like the Vedanta. Um, he believed that there was a divine reality that man didn't see, um, that the contradiction of opposites is the method of life and the means of cosmic and human evolution, and that our fundamental ignorance is rooted in exclusive nature of mind and ego. Um, he became very concerned for the environment as well at this time. He thought that we were creating mountains of ruin, and we were making things that, when they were finished, looked more and more like trash even before they were thrown away. Um, so he was married 3 times in total. He had 7 total children. In October of 1973, he returned from a European tour to back to Druid Heights in California. Um, he had some friends who were concerned with his alcoholism. A lot of people bring this up as a criticism of him, and it does seem like he had been drinking more towards the end of his life. He even ended up in the hospital at one point for tremors or something. Um, I do think that his alcoholism is probably exaggerated. Uh, in a lot of his talks, he sounds completely lucid. So I don't think there was a time where he was quote unquote drinking on the job. It doesn't seem to have negatively affected his relationships. There were no reports of abuse or anything like that. And the worst that his wives seem to say is that he slept around a lot. Um, he obviously had his flaws. I think the alcoholism is exaggerated. But he did have friends who were concerned for his alcoholism around this time. And then November 16th in 1973, at 58 years old, he died in his sleep. He had been under treatment for a heart condition, and I believe that was the cause of his death, was some kind of underlying heart condition, which was probably exacerbated by the alcohol. So, in a lot of his later publications in his life, he was trying to put forward a worldview that drew on Hinduism, Chinese philosophy, pantheism, Zen, Taoism, and modern science. He was trying to say that basically one of his big analogies was that all of existence is a kind of cosmic hide and seek, where God has hidden itself from itself, um, and that by becoming all living and non living things in the universe, God forgets what it really is. Um, and that's the whole point. That is the game of hide and seek that we are all playing now. Then the hiding is us forgetting, and the seeking is us remembering. Um, he said that our conception of ourselves as an ego in a bag of skin is a myth, and that the entities that we call separate things are merely aspects of the whole. He did have some criticisms. He was criticized by Philip Kapleau as well as D.T. Suzuki in some ways for kind of misinterpreting a lot of key Zen Buddhist concepts. He drew a lot of criticism from people who believed that meditation and zazen had to be very strict and specific, and that there was a certain way to do sitting meditation, or that the practice of it was necessary, whereas Alan Watts leaned much more towards a sudden insight style, that a cultivated state of mind could be available at any moment in any situation. Um, Personally, I think it's a bit of both. I think that you can't really get the sudden insight without some discipline, but that if you rely too much on the discipline, you're missing some insight. So that's basically his biography. Um, I went a little bit into the book on the taboo against knowing who you are, which was a short listen. It was only about an hour, and it was like the first half of the book. Unfortunately, not the whole thing, but it was still very good. Um, I also listened to the Joker talk and wanted to go into that a bit. Um, and then I have these stories that I wanted to share, which are some of my favorite stories. I suppose I'll share my favorite one, and then I'll go into the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. So, my favorite story is the one of the Chinese farmer. It starts like this. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came around to commiserate. They said, "Oh, we're so sorry to hear your horse has run away. This is most unfortunate." And the farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back, bringing 7 wild horses with it. And in the evening, all his neighbors came back and said, "Oh, isn't that so lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." And the farmer said, "Maybe." The following day after that, his son tried to break one of the horses, and while riding it, he was thrown and broke his leg. The neighbors then said, "Oh dear, that's too bad. How terrible." And the farmer said, "Maybe." And the next day after that, the conscription officers came around to conscript people into the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" And he said, "Maybe." The farmer steadfastly refrained from thinking of things in terms of gain or loss, advantage or disadvantage, because one never knows. In fact, we never really know whether an event is fortune or misfortune. We only know our ever-changing reactions to ever-changing events. The whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it's really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequence of the misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequence of good fortune. That's my favorite story of Alan Watts, or it might be. It might be replaced by the other story I'm going to bring up, but I'm going to talk about the book on taboo first. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or stories? Nope, then I will continue. The book on the taboo against knowing who you are. This is one I had heard about for a while that I hadn't really delved into, and I'm glad I did, even if I just got the first half of it. It basically starts with, what does it mean to be in the know? Basically, what it means is that there is some kind of secret knowledge or taboo knowledge that you know about that most people don't know about. When we're growing up, we often experience this with sex. Sex is considered a kind of taboo knowledge because uh, you know, kids don't really know much about it, so you kind of whisper, and the person that knows the most is almost revered, and it's this kind of secret knowledge that people don't openly talk about. So Alan Watts says sex isn't really a serious taboo anymore. Coming out of the 50s, he could see that that was not the case. It used to be the case, but there are so many books on it now. There are so many There's so much information that is readily available. So then what is the new taboo? Because there's always something suppressed. There's always going to be some kind of taboo knowledge. So um, what is it that's the new taboo that we can't directly look at because it's too unsettling? Uh, what is the book that parents can give to their kids about taboo knowledge? He says, the Bible has been treated as a sacred cow for so long that it should be locked up for a century or two so people can hear it again with clean ears. And I thought that was very profound. Imagine hearing those words again without all of the baggage and history attached to it. Um, he said the taboo knowledge wouldn't be religious, but it would have to discuss things that religion talks about, such as the universe, our place in it, the mysterious center of experience, which he calls the I myself, life, love, pain, death, whether or not existence has meaning. The taboo knowledge has to discuss all of this. Um, a book that gives meaning to the whole world and our lives in it. He says we don't need a new Bible, we need a new experience, a new feeling of what it means to be I. And this would be the lowdown on life. This is the secret and profound taboo view that is our sensation of self. Or, let me rephrase that. The secret and profound taboo is that our sensation of self is a temporary role, an illusion. Just like every hypnotized person is willing to be hypnotized, we are willing to be in the illusion and to be tricked in this way. The strongest of all taboos is the taboo against knowing who you really are beyond the mask, hence the title of the book. He said, the I, the concept of I that we all have, is so powerful and fundamental that we cannot experience selfhood except as something superficial. And it's so difficult for us to get past that we can only really use metaphors and fables and stories and myths. And in this book, it's kind of cute. He creates like a new myth as if you were going to tell children about it. I'll just do it really quick. It's basically, imagine if a child came up to you and said, "How did the world begin?" And he would say, "There was never a time that the world began because it goes around in like a circle. Like day and night, living and dying, winter and summer, and you can't have one without the other because you wouldn't know what black is unless you had seen it side by side with white. And if you had the world all the time, you would get tired of it. So you leave in order so that you can come back. Like your breath going in and out. You can't hold it in all the time or else you'd lose it. And this is the hide and seek. And in hide and seek, it's always fun to find new ways to seek and to seek someone who doesn't always hide in the same place. And he said God wants to play hide and seek, but has no one to play with but himself. So he pretends that he isn't himself and becomes the world around us. When the game has gone on long enough, we remember that God is all there is and lives forever. We are different in the way that waves are different, but made of the same ocean or water, and this is the Brahman in Hinduism. And he really liked the term Brahman. He uses it pretty often. And he says, it's not that you ought to awaken, it's not that you should awaken. I'm not telling you you have to do this. He says, you can sit back and let things just take their course. I am writing about things taking their course. That it is a part of things taking their course that I write. As a human being, it is just my nature to enjoy and share philosophy. I do this in the way that some birds are eagles and some are doves, some flowers are lilies and some are roses. I realize, too, that the less I preach, the more likely I am to be heard. Um, I think this harkens back to his letter of leaving the church, where he said, I'm just sharing this philosophy because I want to. I'm not looking to convert anyone. I just enjoy this. And I really feel that because that's a big reason why I started this whole server. So he also calls the game of hide and seek the game of black and white. And I think this is where he becomes more of a Taoist than a Buddhist. I mean, he wasn't really one of anything in particular, but I think especially towards the end of his life, he began to be more Taoist because he really saw that play of opposites everywhere. He said, even the state of your brain, the neurons are in an on or off position. They're either firing or they're not. Alex says, similar to what Bodhidharma said, that he had nothing to say but that he couldn't help himself in the same way that a bird sings. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. And that's when it's really genuine, when it comes out of you without effort and without seeking anything other than the appreciation of itself. He talks about this as well in the Jester section, which I'll go into in a bit, where he says basically you enjoy something for itself and it has intrinsic meaning or value in that way. It doesn't have to have any value outside of itself or any purpose or goal. So back to the game of black and white. So he says there's no such thing as a half wave. There's no such thing as an up crest with no down crest in a wave. He even challenges you, can you picture that? Can you even imagine what a wave that was all up crest would be? And if I try, me, Lauren, sitting here, all I get is a straight line, and the wave itself disappears. He says, when you're listening to music, you're also listening to the intervals between notes and the silence, even though you might not realize that you're paying attention to the silence, or you might not realize that you're listening to it because you're not paying attention to it. Mike says, when you know it, you can't help to speak it, even when words are not being used. Very true. So Watts goes into some science here. He says, cause and effect. Causes have effects, which become causes to other effects. And you can't separate the cause from the effect in the way that you can't separate the front and back half of a cat. If you tried, the cat would die. And in that same way, we can't separate any event from any other event. We try to, we see separation and we convince ourselves that this is how the world is. We separate into little bits and we separate this cause from that effect and that effect from that cause, and we don't see how deeply intertwined it all is. He says, instead of playing the black-white game, we play white versus black, or we play black versus white. And he says there can't be winning without losing. So if white wins, black loses, but if black loses, it still helped white win. And that win can't happen without a black there to lose. And that if white defeated black and there was just white left, both would disappear. Because you wouldn't have any white anymore. You wouldn't have any, if you picture the yin-yang, the entire circle would disappear. It would just be blankness. And it would be neither white nor black. And we just don't see this. We don't see this unity because our minds have become so narrow and pick out the world in these separations all the time. he goes a bit on after this, talking about how to be a genuine fake. Um, and he talks about basically you think of yourself as just little me in a bag of skin, and there's this all seeing, judging God and chaos around us, and we're seeking this peace in God and ignoring the chaos and struggling against ourselves and fighting with ourselves essentially. Let's see. One of my favorite analogies that he uses is that the nature of the world is musical. He says all of the stars and galaxies and planets and people and bugs and everything, they just do it. They just do what they do. There is no aim at the future, much in the way that music just is. Like music, existence travels in time, but it doesn't aim at any goal in time. The point of music is every phrase as it unfolds, and you perceive the relationship to earlier phrases and what will be coming with later ones. Everything that is happening is its own intrinsic value, it has its own point. Um, Things do develop and change. A seed turns into a tree, and if you saw that, you might say the point of the seed is to become a tree. But that doesn't really work because then the tree has seeds, and then the point of the tree is to make seeds. And so it becomes which is which. And the answer is that it's all one process, it's all one game back and forth. He even references the word illusion and its etymology. Illusion comes from the Latin word ludere, which means to play. Illudere, the ill in front of it is at or upon, so it basically means to play at, and illudere becomes to mock at. So illusion really comes from the idea of mocking something, which I think is interesting, but what Alan was trying to get to was ludere, which is to play, and that the fundamental nature of existence is just play, and it's all for fun. And so this goes into the Joker concept. Before I get into that, I'm going to take another sip of this coffee and I will tell what might be my new favorite story of Alan Watts's. So, this story had a pretty interesting little article written about it in Tricycle. Tricycle is a magazine about Buddhism. Well, it started as a magazine, now it's kind of an online publication. And the article was about how people really, a lot of strict Buddhists dismiss Alan Watts as kind of shallow or empty of meaning. And this writer was sitting listening to them say, oh, haha, I remember when I was young and stupid and listened to Alan Watts. And then listen to the class go on to tell a story that he had just read in an Alan Watts book. And this is that story. The story is told of a Zen monk who wept upon hearing of the death of a close relative. When one of his fellow students objected that it was most unseemly to show such personal attachment, he replied, "Don't be stupid. I'm weeping because I want to weep." And I almost think it's kind of a koan, because a lot of people come to Buddhism believing that we shouldn't show emotion like that, we should become more neutral to things like this, and that when you have such personal attachment to someone and mourn for their loss, this is a bad thing that Buddhists wouldn't do, and that's why this student was so shocked to see his master weeping. And I think the answer is so profound. I'm weeping because I want to weep. And it's funny because even that classroom that was dismissing Alan Watts didn't realize that they were talking about that same message that he had. And it's so difficult to really understand why it's important. But it is. So that might be my new favorite story, even though it's very short. So, actually, let me tell this other story as well, and then I'll go into the Joker. Because this other story kind of goes into the sense of the self as well as insecurity that we've been talking about. That's a nice quote. There will always be suffering, but we must not suffer over the suffering. Yeah, essentially. This is one of the many paradoxes, is that we seek to be free of suffering, and that causes us suffering. So here's this other story. To stand face to face with insecurity is still not to understand it. To understand it, you must not face it, but be it. It is like the Persian story of the sage who came to the door of heaven and knocked. And from within, the voice of God asked, "Who is there?" And the sage answered, "It is I." "In this house," replied the voice, "there is no room for thee and me." So the sage went away and spent many years pondering over this answer in deep meditation. Returning a second time, the voice asked the same question, and the sage answered, "It is I." The door remained closed. After some years, he returned for a third time, and, at his knocking, the voice once more demanded, "Who is there?" And the sage cried, "It is thyself." And the door was opened. And that story reminds me of that Rumi quote where he says, "I was knocking forever at the gates of my own heart, and then realized I was knocking from the inside."
So where do these stories actually come from? Are they written by Watts or?
No, he's relaying a lot of older stories. He tells them in his own way. Um, but yeah, these are older stories. He actually even has a lecture that's just all Zen stories, which is very fun to go through. So this leads into the main thing I wanted to focus on, which is the concept of the Joker. I think this is a really great original idea. I think that Alan Watts lived this idea in a really big way. He begins by talking about the purpose of the court fool in medieval Europe was to remind the king of his humanity so that he didn't get too stuffy or forget about things like his own fallibility or his own death. He said that monks used to keep grinning skulls on their windowsill of their bedrooms to look at the skull and remind themselves of their own mortality. Now, we in the Western world pretend that death doesn't happen. We don't have an institution that corresponds to the court fool anymore. We have political cartoonists and satirists, and we have comedians, but they don't sit in the Oval Office with the president, and the president can easily ignore them and not ever hear what they say. We don't like it when people suggest that our social institutions are not serious. He talks about how we must allow people to be outcasts from society, to not participate in social institutions, to be separate from it. He said that monks actually used to wear, or perhaps some of them still do wear, dark yellow robes because that's what criminals would wear. And they considered themselves outcasts in a similar way from the society around them. And they wanted that. He said that if you're going to be an outcast from society, you shouldn't have children. You shouldn't expect anything from society like police protection or education, but you should be able to be a non participant. And, in today's day and age, we don't like that people do that. We don't believe that they should, you know. He thought that mystics who separated themselves from this were able to see the close relationship with everything else and, ironically, realize that there is no separation. They discover the illusion of the ego, that the true I myself, which is what Watts called it, is one thing fundamentally. It is the entire game or works going on around us. It is all called Brahman, the Tao. The name doesn't make a difference. One quote from him that I hear him say often is, "You are the witch from which there is no witcher." Um, he said, "Your ego is a game. The necessity for survival is a game. Society is a game, though it's playing a weird game because the first rule is this is not a game, this is very serious. That's why there are no jesters in church, because church is a place to be very serious." And he believed that obviously there should be jesters in church, that, we shouldn't take any of this too seriously, even what we're doing here now. Um, he liked to make jokes in his talk, and I think that is part of why I was drawn to Alan Watts so early on so well, because and yeah, this is part of why I made the jester role in the server. Is he really joked about the whole thing and made light of it in a big way, and he would start to say something that you thought was serious, and then he would just he would just make a joke about it, and his laugh was just so infectious. So here's one example. He said, "Is a zebra a black horse with white stripes, or is it a white horse with black stripes?" And the idea is, meant to say, well, it's both. But he says, the answer is that it's an invisible horse that painted itself so people would stop bumping into it. And then he would have this huge belly laugh. And he said, reality is like this. He said, reality is a kind of invisible affair beyond description that is painted black and white. And this is life and death. This is up and down, sound and silence, the vibrationary character of being. The Joker sees that all of this back and forth is a game, and all of our institutions are not serious. That's a good comic. Laughter was so powerful for Alan Watts. I actually have a story, or not a story, it's talking about laughter as an answer for koans. And he says, laughter is not an intellectual thing. It's an emotional reaction. And the point is the emotional reaction. When someone tells you a joke, if the joke has to be explained to you, you may laugh out of politeness. You may even laugh deeply, but you're not going to laugh spontaneously like a belly laugh, like when you get it. And the object of Zen stories and koans is to produce awakening in a kind of spontaneous laughter sort of way. And this is that sudden enlightenment that I guess the Japanese call satori. Satori is like laughter. It is something that happens suddenly. You don't, as a rule, slowly begin to laugh and then laugh louder and louder over time, because you see a joke instantly. A joke is always a matter of an aha moment. And in the same way, these stories and koans are intended to produce an aha reaction in you of, oh, I get it now. It's clear. And that's the genuine response of laughter to a joke, when you don't have to think about it. And that's why a lot of koans don't really contain any information. And a lot of these weird stories don't really make sense. Their design is not to tell you something, it's not to impart information or knowledge. Their design is to get rid of something, to get rid of a false problem that you are wrestling with, so that the problem will disappear as a result of that aha understanding. Um, yeah, I thought that comparison of laughter and insight was so brilliant. Um, and this is the laughing of the Joker. Another thing that he talks about is that we are all kind of shaking in some way. All of existence is a kind of vibration and shaking, and he says you get to decide if you're going to tremble out of fear and anxiety, or if you're going to tremble out of laughter. And sometimes it's one, and sometimes it's the other. And the whole thing with the Joker is to come into being at the point when the anxiety interpretation of the trembling becomes the laughing interpretation of the trembling. Um, these monks with skulls of the dead on their windowsill in their bedroom, they we think this is a grim thing, but to them this is a grinning skull that is laughing. And the idea of death produces that laughter, that jest. It is just more part of the game. A quote that Alan likes to repeat a lot, I think it's from G.K. Chesterton. Um, Chattering finch and waterfly are not merrier than I. Here amongst the flowers I lie, laughing everlastingly. Though I may not tell the best, surely, friends, I might have guessed that death was but the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. Um, and then he comes back to the zebra, and he says that this is the black and the white. The idea that survival is a good thing in some sense, even if not in this body, is something that we cling to when we cling to just the white stripes or the white interpretation of the zebra. He says, there are people out there who would rather be dead than red, and this comes from the 1950s McCarthy communism, red being a communist. And he says the only reason these people believe that is because they believe in a hereafter where they can go and be rewarded for the stand they've taken against red. And that's the only reason that they say that. We have this tremendous interest in survival, but this is only important if the idea of death bothers you. And I think this goes profoundly into part of the reason why I wanted to call this Dying Lotus. Because we don't like to look at this. We don't like to think of death. And even when we do, we don't like to think of it as something that might make us laugh, as something joyous or part of the game. And it's not even just the nothingness, if you ask somebody what they're afraid of, they might say, oh, not death, just how much death is going to hurt me. But when you really start to think about it, the first horror that you come across is a kind of concept of endless night. The futility of the idea that your entire life, or the life of the cosmos, might be nothing but a flash. And beyond that, nothing. And that clinging to life and that clinging to existence goes back into what he was saying about Christianity, where they were clinging to their beliefs and the concept of life after death and meaning in existence, and clinging to the point that they were killing the message itself underneath all of that. And he says, you happened. You're here already. Your life happened. And what can happen once can happen again. He says something that happens only once doesn't happen at all. What would happen if sound consisted of only one vibration? Um, if there was a time when there was nothing, there must have been something to produce all of the something around us. Um, and nothing is productive for this reason, because you can't have nothing without something. They go together. So there must be something in the nothing to produce the something. There must be that white dot in the black nothingness that produces the white side of the yin yang. The going out of existence implies the coming in. The idea that you are this particular life, this particular ego that came from nowhere and is going nowhere. When you are under this illusion, you don't identify yourself with everything else that exists. Annihilation of consciousness isn't an experience that you can have, because there's no consciousness to experience it. So there's nothing to be afraid of. There is no nothingness that you will ever experience, because there would be no you there to experience it. And if that's going to happen, there's nothing to worry about. And this is a tremendous relief of anxiety when you realize you don't have to worry about death or the future, that it is all one game. Then it really doesn't matter what happens. And that insight and realization, when you really see that, it does produce that laughter. And that's why I think the Joker is such a profound concept. Even with Zen, even with Buddhism. Think about these Buddhist masters that looked down on Alan Watts for not taking their practices seriously enough. I mean, they don't see that the point is not to take it seriously, and that when you do that, you are just like the Christian church, clinging and wanting to make permanent something that cannot possibly be permanent ever. So, yeah, that's kind of most of my song. Any thoughts?
None at all.
Great.
Well, it's your own fault. You did such a good job that we don't have any questions.
Yeah.
Well, shit.
Can't blame us. Blame yourself.
I will. Thank you.
I mean,
I know
can
that
tell another
Alex
story.
and Tiger were familiar with Alan before. I don't know how familiar you were with him, Tiger. And Mike, you are as well, right?
Yeah, Alan Watts was probably one of my first, I guess, teachers, lecturers that I listened to. I really enjoyed his presentation, and the way that he talks, creating like these images in my mind that I could relate to, um, was really, really helpful at the beginning.
Yeah, he was one of my first too. So there used to be, actually, I think it still exists, a podcast called The Psychedelic Salon. So, a lot of Alan Watts's work is copyrighted, especially his lectures, which I believe it's about $400 to buy all of it. His son, I think his son's name is Mark, is very strict about the copyright and will often threaten to sue people who try to post lectures that he wants you to pay for. So this lecture doesn't really exist online anymore. I'm not even sure how you would find it if you bought it, because I don't know what the actual name was. But on the podcast, it was called, the first half was called On Being God, and the second half was called Death. And it was my first time listening to him, and it was so profound that I was crying my eyes out halfway through it. And then when it ended, I had to listen to it all again immediately. And I probably listened to it almost every day for months before his son made the takedown notice and it got taken down from the podcast. I think there are still ways to find it if you go to some of the archive pages on the internet. Yeah, his son, it's ironic because it's like he doesn't understand the point of the talks. And, um, it's this is another kind of weird thing about Alan Watts. All of his children, when they turned 18, he would trip on LSD with them. He would and he would make it a very profound, spiritual, meaningful experience, but he would basically give them LSD on their 18th birthday and sit and trip with them and talk about these things. And some of them, I think, took a lot from it, and some of them didn't really, or maybe even resented him for kind of pushing a lot of this onto them. I'm not really sure what happened, but his son did put together a lot of this stuff, but $400 for what amounts to a bunch of audio tapes is also a lot of money, and he's extremely strict with copyright. He must spend a lot of time looking for these talks online. I wish I could share on Being God and Death with you guys. Uh, I'm sure that there are a lot of lectures that most people have never heard simply because it's behind this huge paywall that might be even different from a lot of these subjects that we do hear about, or might expand on some of these ideas. Like, I wish I could hear more about the Joker idea, but there's really not a whole lot online, and I don't know if it's because it's mostly behind that paywall or what it is.
Well, I see it this way. Like with anything, these things come to you. So in your case, you were lucky enough to listen to it, without having to pay, and
Mm-hmm.
it made a great impact on you. And so the question really is there a need for, let's say, me to listen to this? Am I really supposed to listen to $400 talks? um, because like I think things just come to you that you need, and I've come across some stuff, that isn't available anymore, and I would have problems, sharing this with you, or the idea of it or whatever. So in that sense, I think it's fine. I mean, we can talk about Mark and his, his way of doing business and stuff. But I also think, like, if you're interested in Watts and you like Gareth did, I think, you're interested in actually buying this, then it's probably for you, and you can get something out of it in that way, and it's maybe meant for you. And other than that, I just roll along. And sometimes, like, I was looking for a book earlier today, and I was like, I couldn't find it, and I thought, like, maybe I'm just not supposed to find it and read something else.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I found it when I needed to, or when it was a really good time for me to. And hey, clinging to something that's gone now is the opposite of the message. Um, it was the first time I had heard these ideas, and I think that's why it was so profound to me. Um, there are definitely certain things that ring really strongly with people. One of the talks, or one of the clips that I posted, which was a short one, was that what do you desire? That um, after school animated, and it basically starts with him saying, when I go and talk with students, I like to ask them, what would you do if money were no object? Um, which is basically, what would you do if you didn't have to worry about rent and bills and food? And, they say, oh, we would be painters, we would be writers, we would ride horses, blah, blah, blah. And he says, you do that and uh, forget the money, because if you do it and get good at it, then you can make money off of it. You can make it into your living.
Yeah, and it's also a question about passion, of course. Um,
Mm-hmm. And he says, What would be the point of spending your whole life doing something you don't like doing just to get money so that you can use that money to do what you do like at the end of your life? It's one of my favorites because he talks about what do I desire, and he says, we don't really know, but we think we know. And we start this process where we haven't really thought about it too deeply, and we're like, okay, well, what do I desire? I guess I want, I want money, I want to be successful, I want to be sexy or something like that. I want to live in this or that place. And we get these things and we realize that's not what you really wanted. And he doesn't tell you there is something you really want. He says the final step is a state of desirelessness. And it is a state of, I don't know what I want, and then I'm okay with that. I don't know who I am. It's this ultimate, deep, complete acceptance of everything, including the fact that you don't know these things.
I would have to disagree just slightly.
Okay, go ahead.
I think I think everybody wants the same thing. And that is just to be happy. And that is the pretty much the ultimate goal, even if you don't realize it. But that's what everybody wants, and that's why they do all the things that they do. That's why the drunkard goes to get alcohol, and that is why the student goes to college, and the businessman opens a business, and literally everything you do is to fulfill that want to be happy. That's it. That's everything you do. Because you don't do something to gain unhappiness. You don't go around doing things because you think that will bring me some unpleasantness, right?
So maybe instead of thinking that you would go to this state of desirelessness, another way to think of it is that after a certain point, you realize that you don't need to do something to be happy. You can any anything works and can come to you, and that'll be fine enough. That'll be good enough. Is that what you're saying, Zen?
Um, yeah, essentially that's what I'm saying. But it, I think it takes some time for you to get comfortable with that. The seeking of happiness is essentially your motivation, but that if you pay attention, um, it can all be this sense of happiness. And there's other things that link to this. The sense of feeling safe, secure. Um, that's another big part of it. That's why we do these things. But again, the happiness is the I think the underlying foundation of your motives. But yeah, to come to a place where you're just okay with whatever is happening, meaning that you're no longer have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to things that are uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and
Uh,
that you're just with what is. And if you're able to do that, which isn't really a doing, it's more of just accepting, then that uncomfortable um, event or circumstance it doesn't become uncomfortable. It just is.
Yeah, it pretty much ties into the story of that Lauren shared earlier about the Chinese farmer losing his horse, because he was like meh all the time because he knew, like, you know, it would. I mean, like, yeah, he kind of knew that. He just, accepted things as they are because he knew, like, it would eventually, turn out well, or maybe not. But in that sense, he was not, like, responding to the desire to own the horse, or for his son to be well in that sense. Um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
so things
exactly.
things kind of came to him
Yeah.
in the right way, you would say.
See, I think that story kind of goes into Alan Watts's take on it, though, because you don't really know what you want because what you think you want isn't what you actually want. So if you think that you want happiness and happiness is having 8 horses, it's not what you really want. And even if he has another story where he says, what if you could go to sleep at night and dream 75 years of life from beginning to end, and you could make it anything that you wanted? You could make it 100% happy the entire time if you wanted. And he realizes that's what you think that you want is happiness all the time, but it's only because we've thought about it in a superficial way. We're not thinking about it deeply enough, and that if you spent days or weeks or months doing this every night, you would eventually get tired of it because you'd realize it's not what you're actually looking for is 100% happiness all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, he even went so far as to, apply this example to, the notion of God and what he would do. I think he was talking about the four, okay, forgot the terms, like there were 4 aeons, something like that. He was talking about the balance of good and evil and stuff like that. So, of course, in that perfect empire that he made, he would get kind of bored, and so he would, make up stuff. Um, as like evil, for example, to play with. Um,
Yeah.
but aside from that, one thing that always strikes me in that sense is the notion of the difference between what we want and what we need. Because what we need in that sense implies a greater perspective, a higher perspective in that sense. So again, like the Chinese farmer, he would want something else, I guess, but what he needed was there in that. Because I mean, in this example, it was perfect. But that's kind of, the way I think of it sometimes. Like, because when we speak of desire, we use the word want, which would be like, to possess an object or state of being or something like that. But the notion of needing something could be a harsh lesson, a loss of a family member, going through poverty and stuff like that, and that is needed to establish um, another thing, which, could be happiness or a
Mm-hmm.
way of perceiving happiness. So yeah, it's kind of tricky.
Yeah, and at the end of the video, he says there are 2 reasons why you don't actually know what you want, and that the first is because you already have it, um, which goes into the Buddhist concept of craving and desire and suffering, which is uh, you already have what it is you're seeking. And so if it's happiness or peace or even unpredictability and thrill and excitement, you already have all of the things that you're seeking. And the seeking itself is what stops you from seeing that. Um, and that's the first reason. You already have it. And the second reason is that you don't know yourself. And he says that's because you never can know yourself. You never can know yourself completely. And this is where he uses those really poignant analogies of you can't ever bite your own teeth. Or a fire cannot burn itself. Light cannot illumine itself. Um, you can't see the back of your head with your own eyes. In that way, that kind of self-knowledge is just not possible.
So I would throw in a thought about again the Chinese farmer, because in that sense, we would come to think of the notion of there being something that knows,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a case. Um, and yeah, of course, we can probably perceive ourselves in the whole way, the total way, so to say, as we are humans and stuff like that, biting our own teeth. I get it. But there seems to be, at least to me, some kind of higher mind in that sense who understands that. Maybe it's just like me interpreting into it. Like we could look at the farmer story and think, yeah, there's something, planning out these things in the sense that okay, let's steal the horse first, bring it back, a couple of more, then let the
This is
son have an accident and stuff like
God
that.
testing Job or something.
Something like that. I think of it more in a intricate way of like a clockwork thingy. Um, I'm getting kind of technical here because I'm always I'm also thinking, the universe doesn't have to exist of everything at the same time because, if I, look at it from my perspective right now in this moment, the only thing that needs to exist from my point of view is like me and everything around me. So, um, I'm sure there's someone somewhere in the United States existing right now having a cup of tea or something. But in that sense, in my reality, there is no need for this to exist. You know what I mean? It's like the question that I ask myself, is there something behind my back? And of course, as soon as I turn around, there is something. But I think personally, that's my theory. It might just be created in the moment that it's needed. And so there is more like space, more opportunity to, shift the puzzle pieces and for everyone to have their own experience if there is something like the other in that sense. Because, at the end of the day, it's all based on the I in that sense. Also the IEYE, the point of perspective that God takes. And since he's playing hide and seek, he doesn't have to like basically he's hiding all the world and it's in the dark in the void. So yeah.
So kind of like the world doesn't exist until you're looking at it, like if a
Right,
tree falls in the
right.
forest.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I think the only problem I see with that is that if a tree falls in the forest is still there to hear it, even if you aren't. All of reality is so interwoven that it doesn't
No,
require you because it
but
has itself.
no, but you're not there to see the forest. Only if you go there to ask about the forest noticing the tree. You see what I mean? Like in that example that about the tree falling, we are perceiving the forest already. It's already in our mind, in our field of view. It has been created already. But that's kind of the gist of the whole thing. It's a loop here, a thought loop. Because if we aren't there to perceive the forest that is perceiving the tree to fall, then there's no forest and no tree and blah blah blah. You see? So we have to create the idea of there being a forest in the first. And I think once it has been, created, established in that sense, it's probably there. I can go to the place once again. I can look it up on a map and stuff like that. But since we don't since we only know like a small part of the world, I mean, we assume that just because people around us have explored the world and discovered the continents and shoot rockets into space and stuff like that, that's only hearsay until you board the rocket yourself, travel over to India or whatever.
We're,
Only then it is truly created within your realm.
we're getting into
Within,
epistemology again.
yeah, you're talking about, basically whatever, the only thing that exists is whatever's in your direct experience at that moment. Everything else doesn't exist to you. You can only assume.
Yes.
Yeah, this is definitely how do I know what exists and what doesn't? How do I, you could even it sounds like a video game, like the stuff I can't
Mm.
see hasn't been rendered yet because I'm
Right,
not
Yes,
right.
there.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean,
Yeah.
Alan Watts mentioned it also with the telescope analogy.
What's that?
Well, he stated, proposed that we expand the universe by looking into it. Like the moment we try to, discover more out there, the universe or God has to create more for there to be experienced, and therefore it expands. So that would mean if we don't have telescopes and shit like that, we would only see the sky. Just like our forefathers would. But the moment like we try to, expand our horizon, so to say, there is a need, and that's what I'm implying. There is a need for the universe to expand, and it would do that. Just to give you more space, so to say, for more to experience and stuff like that.
I guess what I don't get is why is it me that has to render things? Like, let's say I'm not looking up at space at the stars right now. Why aren't the stars rendering each other?
Well, I think the whole idea is just based on the limitation of the eye. You know, since we ultimately can only experience through ourselves, like a dot. That is kind of, the starting point, So why would the stars need to render themselves? Like they have no interest in each other in that sense. And I mean, you could argue that they actually do the moment that you render them. You see them there up in the sky, and suddenly they start to interact with each other.
Plus, if I understand the question correctly, if they were rendering each other, that wouldn't necessarily change your experience. It would only be changing their experience.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was changing our experience. I'm just saying I don't think there needs to be a human eye to look at the stars because they don't need to have eyes to interact. I mean, they interact with gravity and with light and with
Yeah, but
probably.
that's already you experiencing all these things. You're talking about gravity and these things, but that's already in your field of view, already in your experience as a human being, because you're thinking about them having this kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't say 100% for sure that they are having that experience outside of my knowledge of it. I could be in a computer simulation where none of this is even real, including you guys. That's definitely possible, and that's why I wanted to talk about epistemology because so many conversations come down to, okay, yeah, I can't be 100% sure, but it's very likely that the rest of the world is there and doesn't rely on me to render it into existence.
I was just, thinking about these aspects and how, because we started with desire and what we would need and what we would want. And I'm basically just exploring like the technical concept behind reality to make this possible, to shift the pieces um, at all times.
I mean, this goes
You know,
into his story or his point about that story, which is that you don't know and you can't
right,
ever know. And
right.
that's kind of the fundamental aspect of epistemology is that the only thing you can absolutely 100% know for sure is that you exist, which is
Right.
Descartes. And everything else could be a computer simulation or an illusion created by a demon or any one of number of other things, the Matrix. But that doesn't mean that we should question things that don't make common sense to us. I mean, it's good to keep that small bit of doubt, which I suppose was the conclusion of that talk. But yeah, it's kind of a given that you can't know any of this stuff for sure.
maybe the reason why you can't ever know is that it's because it's supposed to be a surprise. It's supposed to be some happiness isn't something that can be given to you. It only just kind of you stumble upon it, essentially.
Hmm.
I'm having a hard time even really following you when you say you can't know because it seems that you can.
Well, you can't know because that's the whole point of a surprise. That's what I was trying to get at is that that's the reason why you can't know.
What are we saying you can or can't know?
You can't know what makes you happy because it's supposed to be a surprise. It's supposed to be something that you stumble upon, not something that you can go out and buy or get.
So then we really need to look at what we actually mean by happiness because we could all be using this word and meaning a different thing. So you really would have to break down what do you mean by happiness, and the way that I was explaining it earlier was sort of like this normal person. This we could just say uh, unenlightened person that just goes around and is sort of being pulled around by his desires, and that's what I was talking about. He's fueled by this happiness and he doesn't really even realize that that's what's actually going on, but that is what is fueling most if not all of his decisions.
Okay, so what is happiness is probably a pretty essential thing then. What do you think it is?
I would define it as enjoyment, I guess, or fun, or uh, to use a video game term, replayability, if that makes sense.
But you're referring to a specific thing, I guess, instead of an
Not not a
overall
specific
feeling.
thing, but a certain way of looking at the world, essentially, that brings this happiness or makes you more open to it.
This isn't really about semantics because it's not just about what the word means, but the meaning that we're trying to get at using words. And we only have words to use, so we just got to try our best. So, I mean, at first glance, I would say happiness, probably to all of us, is a combination of feeling good, feeling pleasure, feeling having fun, some kind of enjoyment. Its existence is contracted by the opposite of what it is, which is sadness, pain, frustration, anger, fear.
I wouldn't say that those things go against happiness because
Yeah.
people can be angry but still feel as though they're having a good time.
So it's specifically a sensation that is experienced.
I feel I would define it more as content. Maybe
Okay.
happiness is more of a joyous feeling in that sense, but I relate it to like an overall like sense of being in that sense. So if someone is asking, "Are you happy now?" or "Are you happy with your life?" then some ideas start to occur about what happiness actually is. And
Yeah.
yes, it includes certain aspects like having something that you think you might need, like money or a wife or stuff like that. But going back to the this discussion earlier, happiness, I mean, can come in many ways, and as a guy hinted at, it can be a surprise sometimes. That's what I also said, like, or did I? Well, in the sense of sometimes you really don't know what can actually make you happy, and everyone knows that, I think, because we in this life, in this world we live in, there's so many things that we can experience, like having a trip on a boat somewhere in South Japan, that could be a thing that makes you happy. or anything else, you know, a touch of a person you've missed for a while or something like that. And all these things kind of, you know, add to the happiness meter. But the underlying, you know, idea of happiness or content, I guess, might be a different thing, which then again relates to the question stated earlier about desires and being. I forgot what the actual question but like, you know what I mean, right?
It's about
Like,
what do we really want?
yes. Well, yeah, we start off saying we want happiness, and I would agree. And now we're trying to find out what that actually is.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So in that sense, I guess you can be surprised by life giving you what you need to be happy, or letting go of expectations of what it means or what you think you need to be happy. Because after all, it's, you know, it's all a succession. Like, you know, if you think about happiness in a grander scale, you know, it's every second, every minute, every hour, and so on, until you die, basically. And that's kind of, you know, how
And
big
and
happiness
this comes
in that
back
sense.
to Guy's point about the story and the dream, which is if you could dream any dream you wanted to and you filled it with nothing but happiness all the time, you would start to realize that that's not actually what you really want. However, we want to define it, if your dream was nothing but good feeling and positive experience and nothing went bad and nothing hurt and nothing was difficult, you would get bored with that.
Yeah, only because you define happiness as a feeling of joyness. And like Guy hinted at, you know, you could be happy overall with, uh, for example, you know, right now I could say I'm happy with the fact that universe provides bad and good experience to balance out these things. And with that, I could be happy, but I'm still, you know, having the experience of good and bad. So in the dream, by being happy all the time, um, I would be still unhappy, because I'm probably missing something.
Yeah.
Um,
So I would define happiness as being fulfilled or content. And if you had a dream that lasted forever, where you were fulfilled, content, then you wouldn't want more of that because you would be content. You wouldn't feel the need to change that.
um, Alex just made a great point, which reminded me of children. So maybe it's not something we obtain, but something we digress from.
How would you know what contentment felt like if you lived a dream that was 75 years long and that was the only thing you ever felt? How would you know that it was contentment?
Well, if it was a finite amount of time, then you would have had to experience something before that that wasn't contentment.
So you would need some kind of discontent to compare it to so that you were
Yeah.
able to understand, okay, this is what it feels like to be content.
Yes, of course.
So it sounds like in order to be happy, you would need variety.
In order to be content, uh, real real contentment would include discontent, because, and this is very much the union of opposites, yin yang thing, is they both arise together. And so um, if you lived 75 years in contentment, you would be like a wave that was all upcrest, as Alan Watts would say, which stops becoming a wave. So you wouldn't even be aware that you were content because you would have no experience to compare it to. And I think this is what he means when he says you don't know what you really want, because what you think you want isn't possible without the stuff that you think you don't want. If that makes sense.
Um, this may not be a great example, and if it isn't, cut me off. But do you really need to pain do you, in order to feel pleasure? Like, do you need to take a pin, stab yourself, and realize that's not what you want, and then go, um, I don't know, on the playground and play for a while and realize, hey, that's what I want? What do you really need to do that first part in order to find out that you actually want to go play on the playground?
I want to say yes. Maybe not necessarily stabbing yourself, but um, this is the fundamental meaning behind the yin yang, is if you took away the black, and Alan Watts talks about this a lot. He says if we think that the white and the black fish spinning around each other are fighting, and we want white to win. And if white did win, then both would disappear because white is only defined by black. And if one defeated the other, the entire circle becomes just blankness. Um,
Yep. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's like an in-between state. Um, because like we're talking about like an human experience, and the ideas of pleasure and pain always, not always, but often require some kind of, input or some action. So you could say by me sitting here, I'm neither in a pleasurable state by pleasuring myself, or, taking a needle and pinching my finger, or like, you know what I mean, putting it into my fingers. So um, I'm really content with that. I could argue, I'm neither experiencing pleasure nor pain right now in that sense. So I'm just pointing out, it's a bit difficult to go off of
yeah,
these.
I think there is a neutral state, and that's kind of the state where you don't feel pleasure or pain, happiness or sadness. And Alan Watts likens it to a wave a lot, so I posted this gif of a sound wave because he says, can you imagine what a wave would look like that was all up crest and no down crest? And
So I
yeah,
could argue that this state, maybe, which is also achieved through meditation, the detachment, so to say, from the ego self, or whatever you might come up with, is the actual state of happiness or content, because you're neither, fearing pain or seeking pleasure in that sense.
I guess what I'm trying to say is talking about the human experience. Of course, you can't know contentment without discontentment, but that is part of reality, part of this human experience. And I guess what I am posing is that that's already there. You can't avoid learning that discontentment, but that you can, because you already know that, you can move to a place that you're no longer discontent, and that you could live the rest of your life in that way, without needing to grasp at contentment because it's there, and or push away discontentment because you're just accepting that part also.
Yeah.
So therefore you would still feel contentment. So
Yeah.
does that, I guess that's what I'm just trying to
No, I
put
already
it out.
like came to the same conclusion, basically. Like if nothing is really phasing you, then you're content with that. You could lose $1 million and say like, okay.
I actually,
Yeah.
I, so what do you think about this? Let's say we took it into the mind of a masochist, in which where these people, they find pleasure in pain. I don't know if they find pain and pleasure at all, but they have a different, by changing their preferences, they've basically found a way to cheat that system, in which where pain is something that you want to avoid, but something you can easily grasp as well, or easily want to grasp. Does that make sense?
Alan Watts actually spoke on that thing, and he um, he pointed out that it is actually a spectrum. I guess in terms of physical pain, that's what he was referring to. Meaning that it's like hot and cold water, like you turn up the faucet. And sometimes, if you wouldn't know if it's really hot or really cold, and you just like slide your finger through very quickly, you couldn't, determine what temperature it actually was. I found myself sometimes, uh, um, having a short shock, because I thought it was hot, but it was really cold. So that spectrum kind of, goes into both directions, and in that sense, pleasure and pain for these people can turn into, like, they can turn it into a pleasurable sensation.
Mm-hmm.
So
So,
I'm not sure if you meant that, but that's what he was pointing out there
mm-hmm.
in
I
terms
was
of,
think
yeah, go ahead.
I was thinking maybe, what if happiness is basically having a familiarity with something? So, if I enjoyed being angry, I would be angry all the time, and that would be my form of happiness, to be angry, to be frustrated. Um, I could be happy being depressed, maybe. I don't know how well that fits, but it could be just having that familiarity with those sensations that
Yeah, you
can
can
like
get.
refine yourself. You can refine your taste almost, and it becomes something of an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, but in my experience, it's almost like lying to yourself in that sense. Because I would say humans are more likely inclined to, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. So things like depression and anger, I would really question if you would be truly happy in an angry state, because I think anger is hardly something you want to maintain for quite a while. And
Well, that is for people that are not that kind of person.
it's a different energy, like anger is very like high energy focused, and happiness is more of an open thing, like you open up more, and anger closes you more in that sense. So there is a difference in the states of being.
Again, it's contentment. So it would be like somebody couldn't maintain that anger all of the time. So contentment would also include there not being that sensation or emotion. This is not an emotion, at least the way I'm talking about it. And if, like Alex said, if you needed to be angry, that wouldn't really be happiness because you're needing something to um, continue.
Well, I think I would say that, you made this your happiness by accepting it and living it. It's a bit like the story that you shared yesterday about what is it called? The golden flower. I think I forgot what the organization was called in that story. Y-
Yeah, about the last unenlightened person.
Right, and he kind of made he was basically doing that, taking it to the other end. and
Mm-hmm.
making this
Yeah.
his happiness. So that's kind of interesting.
Um, this has actually been on my mind for a bit. Is it possible that this whole study isn't actually a study that's going anywhere, but reinforcing a new system, I guess, to look at the world?
What study?
This whole I guess Buddhism or whatever, where you start realizing how um, what where you start seeing what is real and what isn't real, um, where you don't exist and your body is you're not actually your body, or so that kind of stuff is it. I don't know, because
It,
it only fits. Those things are only true in the system of ideas that follow them. That makes sense.
I guess I know what you're hinting at. By the way, the story kind of, you know, goes into that too. Um,
What, the Samsara story?
yeah, like I assume you see there's a danger to a certain mindset.
No, no, no. I don't see it as a danger. I mean, it definitely seems like uh, if followed through all the way, uh, you would basically be in a very healthy state. I'm just saying that, is this a truth of the world uh, that is actually true, or is this just a way to is this just another way to see the world?
Both, I guess.
Yeah. It's kind of both. So you would start off with just your normal way of thinking. Oh, this is how it is. It's just little old me, and it's me versus the world, and it's so big, and there's so many dangers, and it's hard, and I have to strive, and I have to succeed, and I have all these things I have to do. I have to keep this body alive, and I got to keep it clean, and I got to do all these things. And so this sort of study is the going into an opposite view, and then once that it becomes very clear, then it sort of folds back in on itself, and it's becomes both. um where like you have the knowledge of this other side, sort of like the you have the knowledge of the dark side of the moon, you could say. And then you come back to the light side, to the everyday, I need to wash the dishes and go to work. But it's integrated that dark side of the moon, and the result is um, sort of cleaning all of that uh, fear and discontent away, and you're just left with everything that the way it was before, but feeling much more um, at ease with it all.
Mm.
So I guess you kind of just cover a truth and also your truth.
Yeah, and then stating anything, you're no matter which perspective you take, you're always going to be wrong because there's always the opposite perspective. So if you're asking a question, then I would need to answer it, and if for me to answer it, I must take a position, and by taking that position, I'm never really able to say the whole truth. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. How everything comes from a origin place, or like you can the way one way I see it is you can you can take any object and uh, basically find so many ways you can connect it with other things, and that's because everything is interwoven in that way. So if you decide to say that this single point represents the whole thing, would be untrue, because that one point makes up a large mass. Um,
Yeah,
if that makes sense, like the idea how there are an infinite number of points that can be stored on a circle, or there are an infinite number of points that you can find a tangent line with a circle
that's
with.
exactly what I was gonna. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is like if you take a sphere, and it's the surface of a sphere, and I ask you to locate the center of the sphere on the surface, no matter which point you you point at, you're going to be wrong and right at the same time.
Yeah, this is true about the center of the universe too, because it's expanded from every possible point. So every point of the universe is the center.
Yeah. So that's what it's like. Um, and being able to speak about anything, you can never really say the truth because you're taking a position. So you're wrong and right at the same time. But that's just words, and it's useful. It can be very useful to direct somebody to these um, realizations, I guess you could call them.
Do you think that it could be possible that language could talk in all perspectives, essentially? Is there a way you can talk about something wholly, not
I
specifically
Um,
with a language that could be
I
created?
I
Is
think I think there would be a new language in that sense. But maybe it's difficult to do it through vocal communication. But more like in terms of uh, well, telepathic communication, energetic communication. Like sending symbols and concepts, because like spoken language is kind of edgy and it's clumsy, and you need a lot of words to describe, at least in like German, English, and stuff like that. I know like the Eastern languages have some words that describe more aspects of a thing, or that are sometimes mistranslated. um, or Alex was talking about a language he tried to learn, called, I forgot what the name was, but it was basically a contextual language. I guess that means depends on how the words are used in context or in relation to each other. So I
maybe,
would, yeah, so I would say yes, it might be possible, but
or maybe instead of thinking of a way to communicate to each other on a specific object, to talk about it wholly, instead it would be best to have the object speak for itself, not literally, but because of this intelligence that makes up reality, maybe it already does the talking itself, if that
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah, I
yeah.
think because I would ask the question, if you were able to talk wholly, why would we need to talk in the first place? Because all we're doing is sharing perspective on the same thing. We
Yeah,
already know it wholly.
Alex said no language. No language has a limit to what it can express. So you couldn't put it in any symbol or language because what the whole thing is reality. You're looking at it, you're experiencing it. That can't be refined or defined. It just is. So
You you you
you
can't
can't do
make
it.
reality with your vocal cords.
You couldn't do that. You can't make reality um at all in any way. It just is reality. And so you can point to it. I can go, hey, there it is. Just stop talking and just look at it, experience it. It's an experience, right? That's what it is. So you can't speak it. You can't draw it. You can't do anything to it. That's just what it is.
Yeah, I think Jelly's kind of right where language is based in duality. I mean, I think that all of existence is based in duality. That's why I'm more of a Taoist. Because it's not just language. I mean, we can look out in the world and not have any ability to speak, and we can still tell that there's a difference between red and green, or sweet and salty. We don't need words. Words just represent these things.
Yeah. You can't get any closer to the sound of a bird than the actual sound of a bird. And you can't really define that, but it just is what it is,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
It's very gooey.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the word for a tree will never be the same as the tree itself, which is
Yeah.
inseparable from all of the rest of existence.
I could plant a forest with my words. Tree, 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 tree.
I mean, if in the beginning there was the word, right?
And that's right.
Yeah, language is inherently dual because it separates everything. Because, and this is an old ancient Greek concept, and I do hope we get to the pre Socratics at some point because, you know, like Heraclitus said, everything exists in the presence of its opposite. So it's not even that we say this is wet and this is dry, but wet exists and dry exists, and we piece them out from reality and separate them so we can talk about it. Um, and it doesn't match with what we're actually experiencing, but that doesn't mean that wet is the same as dry, just like white is the same isn't the same as black, but they're so intertwined that they can't exist without each other.
So
Well, I think language is just one way to, express it. So I'm not thinking really in terms of dualistic, meaning two. You could express a thing through sound or art. So language is just one way of communicating. Of course, it's a separation from reality in that sense by trying to describe it. But like I said, you can describe reality in a different way than language.
here's an idea. If you can point in two different positions, and those two different positions were pointing at black and white, does that does that mean that reality itself is dual, or that I'm creating a language that makes black and white dual?
I would say reality itself is dual because think of any kind of wave, a light wave, a sound wave, waves on the ocean and in water. We don't need language to experience these things, and waves at all wouldn't exist without the top of the wave being different from the bottom.
The reason why I say that is because although in language, if you say something is wet, you are in that it is not dry. Um, in experience, when you dip your hand in water and you take it out, you feel that it is wet, but you don't. There isn't the awareness of levels of dryness at all. So does so in that sense, there isn't. I would argue that there isn't dualness in experience. Because if you start if you start pointing it out, it will become dual. But if you don't point it out and you just experience it, it it just becomes a part of your experience. I don't know how to put it better than that.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. Yes, direct experience is not. It doesn't need an explanation. But then again, there's the dual sense that there is something that is being experienced, and then there is the awareness of that. So it can be separated again, but all of it is happening within awareness.
Even awareness without any kind of labeling is still limited by your senses, and your senses are incomplete and defined by duality. You can't see all of the light spectrum, you can't hear all of the noises going on around you. That in that way, your entire reality is built up around these sensory experiences, and whether or not you pick apart and label it, sound waves still move as waves, and you don't have to identify the up or down crest for them to still exist. You can directly experience it, and in your mind you're not separating it, so you're experiencing a lack of separation, but the world still has color, it still has sound. There's still a difference between empty space and a star or a planet.
Sure, but would you say that there is a limitation if that's the only way we could have experienced reality with our senses? That's the only way we could?
Well, then you're going into could you, should you, you're going into, well, what if?
Well,
But it's
right,
not what if,
but
it just is.
but this is related to limitation, right? I'm saying I'm bringing that up because to say that there is a limitation, that means there are people that can see past that. There's a comparison between something. Are you comparing in that sense that there's so much more to reality that we don't see? Or are you comparing it with the potential to see more? Or ah
I'm not trying to make any comparison. I guess I'm just making a point about limitation. And the reason the limitation exists is because, in my mind, reality itself is inherently dual. And whether or not um, we perceive it as separated, there is still a difference between the light that your eyes can interpret and the light that you can't see, or the sounds that you can't hear. And so your reality is bounded by duality, by the nature of light waves, sound waves, and the vibrations of atoms and nuclei, quarks, vibrational strings, whatever is making up the reality. All of it's constantly moving and shifting. This is the duality game. Is it's always moving from up to down and from black to white and from happy to sad, and this is the cosmic hide and seek that we're in, as Alan Watts would say.
I I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily agree with that because when you look at black, you're not aware of white. And when you look at white, you're not aware of black. So, I wouldn't say that reality is dual.
What do you mean you're not aware of it?
Well, if you're looking at black, you're obviously not seeing white. You're seeing black. So, if you're saying that reality is dual, then that means that I would be aware of both. That I would be aware, not necessarily both at the same time, but like like on the outside of my vision, there's a little bit of white, so it's all good. I'm saying that if if I was in a totally black room and reality is and if reality is dual, I would be able to see white in that room somewhere, and vice versa in a white room. Does that make sense, or does that?
Mm,
It would only make sense if, you know, the statement was that they both have to be present at the same time. But in that sense, it's more of a concept than well, physical state, I guess. So I kind of get, you know, the gist of by saying, you know, just because you can experience one thing doesn't mean there has to be another.
no, there would be, because if you were in an all black room, you would only know that it was black if you had seen something other than black, like white or any other color. Blind
But
people
does that?
don't see black, they just see nothingness. And without white to compare it to, black would turn into just nothingness to you. There would be no black.
So as long as there is that comparison between, hey, I had this experience and I saw white in this experience, and then there's another experience where I saw black, and as long as I can compare the two, there is duality.
Yeah. If you only knew black, then you wouldn't know it as black. You would just it wouldn't be anything.
I
You
don't.
wouldn't have any other thing to compare it to.
I'm not talking about if I only experienced black. I'm saying if I only compared black. If I am comparing black at all in in this it, right now. And the reason why I say that is if as long if the reason why duality exists because of that, then that means that it's because of a language that I'm using, because I've created this connection between the two, that sure it exists, but it doesn't matter if it exists because there are millions more that exist as well.
Again, I think this comes back to that spot on the sphere. You're you can take a position, but you're wrong.
Well, let's
Yeah.
take
So
this let's take this black room example, because I like this idea. Let's say you were born and you're in a black room, everything is black, you're black. You would be essentially blind. You wouldn't know it was black. You wouldn't understand it was black. If someone came up to you and said, you live in a completely black existence, you wouldn't know at all what that meant. Until one day, someone introduced white into your experience. You wouldn't have to label either of them, but as soon as white was introduced, black would exist, because suddenly there's something different than what's around you. So without the white to compare it
Right.
to, black also doesn't exist. But as soon as you introduce white, they both arise simultaneously. And this is the essence of duality, is that you can't have one without the other. You can't have a wave that's all up crest. You can't have just black without white.
Now, I understand that in this situation, once white is introduced, that that this there is this difference between the two, and that there is um, that because of this visible difference, it seems as though um, they imply each other. Well, not really. You don't think about if they imply to each other in that moment. You wouldn't think about if they imply to each other at that moment. You would just see that this is a totally different experience to what I've had before. And
yes.
I would say that sure that the only reason why that that comparison is being made, uh, Give me
I
a
mean,
second.
this is the structure of space and time. Because how can here exist without there? How can up exist without also having down? Time and itself is just change, and the only reason we know that anything changes is because there's a comparison to what it was before. So all of space and time, which are themselves fundamentally linked, is duality in essence. I don't think it requires language. I think language rose up because we were trying to describe these differences around us. We're seeing things change over time. We're seeing the impermanence of things. We're seeing that up is not the same as down and black is not the same as white, and we create the words to try to explain what we're seeing. I don't think it's I think saying that language created duality is putting the cart before the horse, because for me anyway, ever since the Big Bang, hydrogen was different from helium, and the fact that those spaces are different, the fact that an electron is different from a proton, or that there's such thing as space between electron and a proton, is duality itself at the most fundamental physical basis of it. And all of our reality stems from the fact that these things are not inherently the same. They don't behave the same. They don't move in the same way. They don't occupy the same space.
Yeah, I mean, if you remove language when you're doing this black room analogy, just take language out. Say you don't know what black and white is. You were correct that it would just be a different experience. If you can just remove any of the labels attached to black and white, you would just know that this was a new experience. At least I can imagine it to be that way. That I wouldn't know even what this other thing was. All I know is that it's different than what I have been experiencing.
And that it's different from me, because
Yes.
I am not what I'm looking at.
So then what if so I'm trying to see if I can argue that reality is dual here. That's I guess
That it is?
my point. That it is non-dual. Um
It's both. It is both dual and non-dual.
Yeah, the
well,
non-dual side of it is that you can't take away one without taking away both. So they're fundamentally connected, but that doesn't mean that they're the same. If everything was the same, nothing would ever change.
well, well then this is what if what about in the perspective of experience, in which where if you only have one experience, not to say that you only have one experience of one single object, but if you basically take your whole lifetime and call it as one experience, would that make it non-dual?
Okay, maybe I'm not understanding, but imagine that you're floating in a void. You can't feel anything, you can't hear anything, you can't see anything. There's nothing to taste. There's nothing. But you would be there being aware that you were there, right?
Sure.
Okay. So there is the experience of that. So there has to it's also the experience of um the lack of not being that. Does that make sense?
So an experience of non-experience.
You're experiencing
Oh,
the
or
void.
you're experiencing that the void is not you, but
Y-
there's something else that's you.
Which would be you being aware, having the experience.
Okay. Right. So then in that moment there would be a duality where there's other and then there's me,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the psychological basis for the sense of a self, is that there are things around me that are not myself. You know, if I see
But
someone else eating, that doesn't get rid of my hunger.
but if I don't point that difference out, does that is reality still dual?
Would you still be hungry?
If I yeah, I
Then
mean
yeah.
that I'm not saying it would change my experience, but I'm saying that I would be paying attention to, oh, I'm hungry, rather than uh, that I'm hungry but I'm not uh, and I'm not full, essentially. No, that doesn't make sense.
It's complicated. It's especially complicated because words themselves are so dual. And that's why the Hindus, they don't say oneness or everything or the universe. They came up with this term non dual because it is so completely inclusive. Um, and it's the only thing, it's the closest they could get to being what they're actually trying to describe, which is non duality.
Um, so then would you argue that so then what is a non-dual experience then? Would it just be the nothingness, the the lack of no, the lack of experience
No, I think
that
you
would
would
be at,
you'd be hungry and filled at the same time, something like that.
If it was complete non duality, um, how could you not be aware of something that was going on beyond your field of vision? Or why do you not know the thoughts of somebody else? You're still limited by your human experience, your human senses, your brain. Um,
but am I aware of those limitations?
Your question was what would be a non-dual experience? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that would be no experience at all.
So it
that's a
would be
really
no
good point. Yeah,
experience at all.
Because yeah,
So as
you
long
just
as
because there'd
so
be
as
no you
long
to
as I'm
experience it.
yes,
so so as long as I'm able to point at something, then it will always be dual. Is that what you're arguing?
yes,
Because there's
yeah.
you pointing.
Okay.
There's you and the pointing and the thing that you're pointing at.
And even so then what if I didn't point at all? What if I just stopped doing that?
Who's
Just
stopping?
because I still have the okay, don't go there. I'm trying to get to a point. If I still have the ability to point, if I as long as I have the ability to point, that does that mean that that reality is dual? No matter
It's
even in then.
still you experiencing something. So the something is the other thing. Even if you're not labeling it, even if you're not pointing at it, this is currently your experience, is it not? That there is an awareness of something, correct?
Right.
And what you're
That's
aware
it.
of is not you. It's something other than you.
Well,
You
something I
don't have to.
identify as other than me.
You don't have to point at it. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to do anything. It just is. It's just there. That's just it. I can't really put it in any other words.
Yeah, and words break down. It's difficult.
Like you're looking at it, and if you could just remove like all the thinking, right? Don't think about it. Just what I guess you're looking at your computer screen. Look at it without thinking anything. If you can do that, can you try and stop the labeling? Try and stop the mind speaking about it and just be with the experience of that you're seeing it.
Sure.
That's as far as you have to go.
Right.
That's it. That's not
Because
pointing, that's not labeling,
yeah,
that's nothing.
I,
It's just
I I
experience.
I understand what you mean, because because all those identifications just create confusion that this thing is other than me, when in reality this is something that I am taking in from my eyes, and it's just becoming a part of my experience. Therefore, it is me.
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
Hmm.
Huh?
Okay, so if you look at something that you can identify it as other than you. However, because you're looking at it, you're you are creating this experience that it's there, and you can feel it, and you can lick it if you want to. I don't know why you do that. And then you could do all of these sorts of things. But the reason why you can do this is because it's a part of your experience. Therefore, it isn't not you. It is you.
Yeah. Yeah. It
It has to be you.
you're actually not even, yeah, it has to be you, but you're not even actually doing anything, right?
Yeah,
You're not, it
it's
just is.
it's 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 being done.
Yes. Exactly. It is being done. There's no doing. It just is being done.
This I guess this was was my was what I was trying to say. If you pin it as this experience, does that can if you look at as though only the experience matters, then that does that make reality not non-dual?
Um, I guess in a way it
That's
can.
what I meant.
it- I guess, yeah, in a way you could say it in a way that the only thing that is happening is awareness. So there is the experience of being aware, and that which you are aware of is awareness. So there's only really one thing happening. Um, I think that
So yeah,
explains.
exactly. And so anything that you would point at, or anything that would be um, you would identify with, that would all just still be you.
Yeah.
You creating this whole environment, this other thing. When and if that's true, if it's true, well, I mean, I'm not going to try to argue that it is true. Then duality couldn't exist, because we only have our
Again, it's
experience.
both. It's both.
Why
You can
why
you can it's perspective. You can flip it. It so you're trying to get to like the root of, like,
right.
you're trying to take a stand. You're saying you want a definitive answer that you can stand on. And I think what Lauren really is trying to point out is you can't, because there is also dual, but you can also have that experience of oneness. This is what they talk about with things being empty and also being oneness,
Hmm.
sort of. Yeah. So it's these both of these things are happening simultaneously,
I mean,
and so
here,
then it
Oh, I get it now. I
think
get it.
about
okay.
what reality
Because
would look
hold on,
like
hold on.
if it was just non-dual all the time. There would be no variation, no
Well,
change, no difference in anything
hold
ever.
on. The, that's not necessarily true, but here's why. Here's why. Because of God damn it, fucking whatever. It's gonna break my argument. So because there is the physical world, and then there's the mental world, your experience. You can be pointing at something in the physical world, and you can point at another thing, and in that world there is dualism. But in the mental world, there isn't dualism. There's only this one experience of everything.
I think that's close, very close, if not right on. I feel like you understand what I at least what I'm saying. Yes, you're
Yeah,
right. You're correct. You're hitting the target now. Yeah. So there's almost like these three different stances you could take then, but you can't experience them simultaneously, really. They're just sort of these different windows you can kind of look through. That is the duality, the oneness, and then sort of seeing both of them um, sort of at the same time. But you can never really take that as it. You just know that this is what's going on.
You really can't, I think, discard duality though, because an existence that was only non-dual would have no change. Any time that change exists, it must be dual. It immediately snaps reality into this opposite dance back and forth, and
does it
that's all
does
that
it have
time
to be
is.
dual, or does it have to be what it is?
Anything that is change and variation and difference is by definition dual.
Right. Okay. So because that there is a difference between um, clear water and dirty water, then there's that dualism. But if you take a cup of clear water and start dirtying it up over time, if you're only in that now moment, it's just you just see it as it's getting dirtier. So
But
it's
that's
not that,
duality. The only way you would know if it was getting
but
dirtier is if it was previously
it's
clean.
getting dirtier, but it's not it. You're not paying attention to if it's getting cleaner in that moment. Does that make sense? So to
Mm,
to basically communicate it, it makes more sense to say it's getting dirtier rather than it's not getting cleaner. So therefore, it because you're not experience it being not clear or not clean. You're experiencing it being dirty. Or does that make sense? That sounds like I'm I'm pushing your dualism. I'm I just I'm just saying that there is only that one experience throughout that whole change, and
Yeah.
therefore
change of what?
that's why it's dual. That's why it's non-dual.
Just I
Damn
feel
it.
like you got it, guy. You got it. You don't need to try to like explain it. You got it. Like it's both. It's both.
How do you so okay now? So I understand what it means to have a non-dual experience, but is it possible to have a dual experience?
Yeah, it's what Lauren has
In
been
that in no no hold on, in the sense that we're talking about it, where you have where you actually can experience it being dirty and not clean or whatever.
What is water then? How do you even know it's water? Can you even
Because
have water without duality?
well, if you look at water, you're not thinking about duality, you're looking at water.
Who is looking at water? You
My
see, it all breaks
eyes,
down.
the eyes the eyes are looking at water.
So the eyes are not the same as the water?
Right, okay, but I'm asking how to have a dual experience.
You mean a non dual?
No, no, a dual experience.
Yeah, as soon as you look at water.
Doesn't make
because
sense.
because there's the awareness that is experiencing the object. There's a location, I guess you could say.
Because
Oh,
you
You
are not
guys
the
having
same as the water.
experience.
because you can point to it.
Well, you're
You're
there's
looking
the
at it.
you,
I mean,
there's you, the awareness, and the thing over there. If you think about this too hard, your brain's gonna explode. So maybe you
Real
should just-
non-duality, there would be no you, there would be no water. There's no such thing as water in non-duality because there has to be something that's not water. There's no such thing as dirty without clean. I mean, in order to have real non-duality, all of these things can't exist.
okay. The reason why I don't think it makes sense is because we I thought we've already defined non-duality as there's only this one experience of it. Is that still correct? That non-duality is that one experience, and dual would and if that's right, would that mean that duality um, is that being able to point at it, or is there uh, dual experience? Is it possible to experience two things at the same time?
What is an experience without an experiencer?
No. You
what's your experience when you go to sleep and you're not dreaming?
Yeah.
there wouldn't be one. Okay.
There-
So that
There's
that
your
not,
there's you having the experience of non-dual.
What
That's
does
it.
your head look
Everybody
like?
gets it.
What does the back
Oh.
of your head look like to your eyes?
okay. So you guys are suggesting that that experience is non-dual. It is dual.
For me, it is, because it's experience. As soon as you
But-
say there's an experience, there's some way that you know that. There's some way that you're aware of that.
But if you're pointing at yourself, if you're pointing both at the physical world and at your mental projection of it, there's one instance where duality exists, the physical world, and the other instance where where non-duality exists, the mental world.
Right, that's why it's kind of both.
So I was asking if it's possible to switch those around, in which where physical reality is non-dual, and then okay, so that's a non-experience. Damn it!
I know. That's why they use the word non-duality, because it's so difficult to talk about it. I'm not even convinced you can experience non-duality at all. I know that's what a lot of people seek.
I think I get it now. I think I understand now. Because if you take both positions of other and you, then there's nothing else to look at.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. Okay. Cool.
As soon as one exists, both exist.
So, what makes more sense to function under? Non-duality or duality?
Uh,
Don't
you'll
really have a
can-
choice.
figure that out yourself.
How can you function under anything if there's no you and no place you're functioning in, or life within this functioning that's happening? The question itself is dual, and so the answer must be as well.
You could also put it as this is the way you've always
I'm
been
asking you a
functioning, so
question.
you don't. This is the way you've always been functioning, so you don't need to do anything
Yeah.
different.
I mean, okay, yeah.
Because the question was how. You don't need.
No, I mean, because if we're able to say that reality is dual or non-dual, then there's that possibility choice. Well, there's that at least the illusion of choice, that there's a difference between the two and you can experience one or the other.
Exactly. The illusion of choice. That's
So
it.
then, so we should probably be talking about Alan Watts.
This is what he talks about. He brings
I
this
mean,
up all the
okay.
time.
Well, if you want to keep going, I guess. um, well, I guess what I meant was to what should be paid more attention to? Should we pay attention to the, how the world is dualistic, or how the world is non-dualistic, or how reality is non-dualistic? Whatever.
There's no should. You just get rid of that word.
Trying to chase something like non-duality and um, oneness with all of eternity is to reject the fact that you are separate from other people. And really, in my mind, that's part of the beauty, is that you're not the same as other people, and there are differences, and that's what makes existence so interesting. That's what makes art and music. I mean, music wouldn't exist without duality. There's so much beauty that wouldn't exist if everything was actually the same.
And you said, which should somebody focus on? And so there's no wrong answer.
Mm-hmm.
It would really depend on, what do you hope, I guess, to gain out of it. And if that is the case, then I would encourage you to experiment.
Okay.
Figure it out for yourself. Try it out. And then, because I can't tell you the answer, because the answer is for you to discover that. I can't give you that answer. It's
Oh, all
I,
right.
I,
That's
wouldn't-
fair enough.
I wouldn't even for a second want to limit you to that. Like I just wouldn't do
No.
that to you. You understand?
Yeah, I get it. I I was just hmm. I was actually about to ask if someone is enlightened, do they experience the world in a dualistic way or a non-dualistic way? And I think that actually goes back to a koan, in which, where do you eat with the mind in the past, present, or future? And it the the person that was asked that basically looked into this book for like a whole day, and at the very end the woman came back with the answer saying, you eat with your mouth. So it's basically
Yeah.
saying it's whatever it is.
It's so many been said so many times in so many different ways. It is what it is. Just this. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's thousands of books written on this very simple, I guess, understanding. Very simple.
I mean, to
Incredible.
even ask the question, what is this person experiencing, and is it non-duality? With non-duality, there's no person and no experience. So even trying to form the question switches it into duality. There would be no person to experience it. It's not to say that things are separated. This is the illusion in our heads, is that we separate things, we cut them apart into bits, and we pretend like things exist in a vacuum, as if you could separate the person from the experience, but you can't, any more than you could cut the bottom half of a coin off, because as soon as you cut it, you have a bottom half again. The coin itself would have to disappear into nothingness for you to get rid of the top and bottom half. And in that same way, all of reality is built up and intertwined. Alan Watts uses the example, you have a front half of a cat and a back half of a cat, and you can't separate them without killing the whole cat. And in that same way, you can't separate anything in existence without all of existence disappearing. but still the front half is not the same as the back half. They are fundamentally interdependent, but not the same. And this is why it's both.
Okay. Then, if we agree that well, I guess what I'm arguing is kind of related to solipsism, where there's only the one experience. But if we if we can only say that, uh, mm, eh, I don't know
So,
if you guys are going to go along with it.
so I do want to interject and sort of, we don't have to talk about this, but just as a point that is, I think, important to keep in mind, is that okay, so there's this training, this thing that we do, which is to look at our experience. That's one thing. There's this meditation practice, which is really coming into deep contact with the um, awareness. And what all of this is really doing is it's breaking down identification with a single object. Most people take that object as this is me, I'm the body, I'm these thoughts, I'm, you know, it's all of that. And because of identification, and also um, wanting or grasping and aversion, pushing away, there's this experience of suffering. Um, and so doing this practice and investigating and looking into these, um, into reality and the way that it works, it creates a separation in a healthy way that you become more content and peaceful, and the experience that you're having becomes in a way more enjoyable because you're no longer resisting it, because you're seeing things much more clearly. And so all of this that the Buddha was talking about and teaching, these different ways and these different methods, not just um, the, I wouldn't even limit it to Buddhism. Like there's other religions that do this, but this is sort of what it's about. It's about you you're doing something to yourself that's not necessary, and what you're doing to yourself is causing you a lot of um, pain and suffering, and that's sort of the medicine, because you have um, you've misidentified the issue, and by doing that there's creates a problem.
Yes, yes. And I think this
I
is fundamental to his point in the story about um, accepting that we don't know and dropping the need to know.
That's a really good point. It's okay, like don't take this wrong way, like you don't look at it, because this is exactly what I'm talking about. Don't look at it and go, oh, I'm feel this need to know, and you're telling me I shouldn't need to know, so then like I'm doing something wrong. Like that whole construct is exactly what we're talking about, where like it's okay, like it's okay for you at your at this point where you are right now, as this person that I'm speaking to do this investigation and do this looking, and sort of you're sorting it out, you're getting it sorted out for yourself, and that unfolds differently for each person. And so you just, you continue to do that until it becomes clear enough for you that it isn't an issue anymore. um, it's important to kind of have friends and community like this to sort of bounce things off of each other, and um, it helps things become sorted because these other people can point out these blind spots that may not be seeing, or also um, confirm what you are seeing. So don't get caught up. I just want you to be careful not to get caught up with like I'm doing something wrong because I have all these thoughts and they seem to be confusing. So you're fine where you are. All right.
Yeah, I would agree. And this is the difference between, I would say, duality and non duality is like, with non duality, there's no movement, there's no experience, there's no person that can point to something else, there's no glass of water that you can look at, there's nothing that you can look at all because there's no you, and there's nothing other than you.
Well, yeah, there's no you to point to. That makes sense. Okay.
Well,
If you'd have just said that in the beginning, right? There, you can't point at yourself when you are.
Yeah.
yeah, there would be nothing to look at. There would be no person to look at it.
I was thinking about how the whole idea, if you can't if you cannot say anything is objective, is that objective? And I I think the reason why you can't say it's objective is because it's coming from a subjective source. These questions are coming from us.
Yeah, exactly.
So we can't say what is objective because we are inherently subjective.
Yeah, this is why I talked about the limitations of our senses. All of our experience is subjective based on these limitations.
Also, look even closer at like your questions or your thoughts. Like, where do those come from?
They just come up.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, so the reason why I was bringing that up is if we are inherently subjective in nature and we can only have a subjective experience, does that mean that there is no subjectivity and there is no objectivity? Because because everything is fluid, but there are things that stay in place. So there are things that are true, but then after a certain point that they're not, which would make them subjective, yes, but because there is no possible way that objectivity could exist, then subjectivity becomes the new objectivity.
What is
And
something that
therefore,
doesn't change? You said there are some things that are permanent.
well, some things that can be seen as permanent, and then there are some things that can be seen as fluid. I mean, okay, maybe in a very literal sense. Okay, don't even think about that one. I'm taking that. What you should pay attention to is that if we can only have a subjective experience, um, and we could only ever have subjective ideas, thoughts, feelings, so on and so on, does that mean that um, subjectivity becomes the new objectivity? Does that mean that our own emotions are are true? They are the real thing. Does that make sense? Because objectivity can't exist, and therefore, if objectivity can't exist, then only subjectivity. Then that means that subjectivity becomes objectivity, which is a paradoxical,
Why does it
meaning
become objectivity?
because there's nothing else. There's nothing else other than subjectivity, and therefore there is no subjectivity. There is no objectivity.
The only way that subjective could become objective is if subjective still existed. So yeah, if one goes away, both go away. So you couldn't have
Right.
only one or the other.
So if we can't say that there is, well, that means we lack the ability to see the objective world. But the thing is that if we see it, then that means it's still coming from a source, meaning that it's still subjective. So then objectivity still doesn't exist.
Let's define this a little bit. So like subjective would be it's true to me, but it's not true to everyone else. Is that right? And then objective would be like it's an objective truth that this server exists because we can all agree that it exists.
Mm-hmm. But because but that would mean if we all agree that it exists, then we can, it's only because that we see it ourselves. It's not an objective fact of the world that this server exists because they don't have access to this information, or they never seen this server before.
So you're saying it might not exist?
It doesn't exist to other people until you introduce it to them.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not an objective truth, right?
No, I wasn't suggesting it was an objective truth. I'm saying that if you go up to a person, a stranger, and you introduce to them this server, then before you did that, this server didn't exist to them.
Okay.
It's only exists when it's introduced into their.
It only exists to them subjectively when it's introduced, not objectively.
Right. Yeah. No. It doesn't change the physical reality of their existence. It changes their subjective reality.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, there's definitely facts out there that are real that you aren't aware of, but that doesn't mean that they're not, real.
Mm.
He's
But-
still separating himself from the rest.
You have no
Everything
choice.
that's being experienced is happening everywhere at the same time. And we're all the same consciousness, so we're all experiencing it just separately. So
That
just
sounds a
because
lot like-
somebody else knows something that you don't doesn't mean you bring it into creation by thinking it or knowing it. No, it's
You
all
bring
happening
it up,
together.
and therefore it exists to them. So it wasn't a problem of it not physically existing in the world, but it was a problem of pointing it out, creating that subjectivity.
What do you mean?
So okay. If we all went on a hike and we we decided to go to the Porcupine Mountains. We'll be walking in the forest for a while, and I see a blue jay. And if I decided not to point it out, and we all kept walking, not to say suggest your abilities of awareness here, you all would not see that blue jay. But once I pointed out to the to you all, you the blue jay would come into existence for you. So it's not that the blue jay is physically coming into existence, but rather it's coming into our experience of existence.
You're making awareness. I don't think is the same thing as existence.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Right.
it's awareness. You just become aware of the blue jay. That doesn't mean that it comes into existence. You just become aware of its existence.
Right, but how do I? So you can be in a room, and you can have all of these noises going on inside of that room, but that doesn't mean that you can hear all of them separately. If someone to point were able to point them out, then they would be able to see them all separately, and therefore they would have um, a different, not a different experience of it, but it would it would be an experience with the identifications, I suppose. No, that's not right.
Patterns.
To you, it would be new. Before then, it didn't exist to you. Is that
It's not that it didn't exist to you. It's just that you
It
weren't
didn't.
aware of it.
It didn't? Yeah, I mean that's. I'm essentially trying to say that too.
How can you become aware of something that doesn't exist?
No,
Its existence
that's
has to
that,
precede
okay.
your awareness of it.
Okay. It seems like it didn't exist until after the fact. So it's kind of like an optical illusion. Or where's Waldo? That's even better. So you can look at this landscape and see it all, and you may be looking Waldo right in the face, but not even know it. Now, if I see Waldo and you don't, we both you can't point it out. Maybe that would be a better way to say it. Then that I'm not saying that I have a different experience of reality, but rather I have no. That's weird. Hold on. I'm sorry.
The existence of Waldo has to precede my awareness of it because my awareness of it is an effect of its existence, and the cause is the existence itself. I can't be aware of something that doesn't exist.
It has to do a lot with pattern recognition in your awareness. Think of listening to 4 songs, 3 of which you've never ever heard before, and the 4th one you know. Now, if they're all playing at the same time, you'll recognize the one you know, and you'll be aware of it. The other ones, you won't recognize the patterns until you've listened to it a few times, and then you'll be like, oh, well, I know that one's separate from that one, and that one's separate from that one, because I recognize the patterns.
So then, what would you call introducing a new fact to someone?
Just what everyone has said, awareness. You're being made aware of it.
All right, whatever.
I personally stand in the position that it doesn't exist until you become aware of it.
Yes, thank you.
Then how do you become
There's
aware
no
of it?
Because
What do
someone
you-
pointed it out.
well, because it comes into awareness. You can't really, if you want to, you could say, well, I can't prove that it didn't exist before I became aware, but at the same time, you can't prove that it did before I came aware of it.
Didn't we talk about this earlier?
Probably.
By talking
touched-
about the stars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just
that?
where I stand.
So
And
wouldn't it
I'm
be
not
fair?
claiming. Sorry, Turtle?
Would it be fair to say that since you're in duality and that's nothing but contrast and understanding, that each perception is going to be an individual one, so it doesn't actually exist for you individually until you are.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And I'm not saying that my take is correct. I really, when I speak, I'm not speaking like in absolutes, like I'm trying to convince y'all that this is the way it is. This is the concrete reality. I'm just speaking from my own view, perception, and that uh, I'm sticking to this awareness because that is my experience. That's all I have to go off of. And so if I'm not aware of it, or if it's not within my field of awareness, then there's really no point to think it exists.
If my okay,
Everything exists. That's the fun part.
if my keys were on the windowsill, yet my awareness was looking at the windowsill, but I couldn't see my keys, why am I not able to see my keys? If the keys are in my awareness, so what's stopping me from seeing my keys?
Are they hidden behind something, or are they just
No,
sitting on the
they
window?
they are plain to see.
Then you're not aware of them.
Then you're not aware of them. They're there, but you're not
Even
aware.
though I'm looking in the same direction as them.
Yeah, I
'cause
mean, this
you're-
happens with sound all the time. People will hear a noise and not be aware of it because they're tuning it out, but your ears are still picking up the information.
I used to live by train tracks, and trains would go by all the time. And after being there for a couple years, I stopped hearing that train whistle. I just didn't hear it. Only on occasion would I register that I heard the train whistle.
Let's take a different example here. I want to approach this from the other way. Let's say that you were told by someone else that there's a sound in this room and you had been in the room before but you weren't hearing that sound, but now someone outside of the room is saying, "Hey, this sound is here." So now you're aware that the sound exists but you're still not hearing it yet. So does it actually exist, or does it only exist when you go back in the room to listen to it?
It would only exist if I could hear it. Beyond that, it would just be an idea that this person says that it exists. So it would just be his.
But the only reason that
Practically-
you're aware of it is because this person told you, or else you wouldn't have noticed it.
Practically, it wouldn't exist until I heard it. Realistically, it would exist
Do you have a car?
if as long as this person is telling the truth, it would exist. I just wasn't able to point it out.
Do you have a car?
No.
No.
I have-
Do you have
I have a bike.
a bike?
That'll work.
That's not really. No, that won't really work.
Well, let's just assume he has a car.
Okay.
That-
I have a car.
Sure.
Okay, you have a car, whatever brand car it is, and when you first got that car, you thought it was pretty cool, and you're driving it for a little while, and you start to notice everyone else has that car. Your car is everywhere, and you never even thought about that car before. Everyone's got one. You see it all the time.
Yeah, when we talk about coming into existence, it's almost like
You're coming
picturing.
into awareness.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
not that the blue
I
jay, like
guess.
the heart and lungs and blood and feathers were all put together out of nothingness before you became aware of it. Those things were already there. Um, just because your senses weren't picking it up or your brain hadn't noticed it yet doesn't erase the physical existence of the blue jay, because that physical existence is what causes your awareness after the fact, whether it's through someone else pointing it out or through hearing it or seeing it. It has to be transmitting some signal in some way, or else you're not going to be aware of that signal. Like the analogy with the TV that Mike likes to use, I mean, the signal can be streaming in, and whether or not the TV is picking it up has nothing to do with the signal itself existing.
Well, if the signal is not coming through, then how do you know that the signal is there unless you have some way of testing?
Well,
Your brain can sense 10% of the waveform of the universe.
how do you become aware of the blue jay? Let's say you're by yourself in the forest and you've been tuning out the noise
Senses.
of it singing. How do you become aware of it?
You can't. As long as you're not aware of it, you can't.
Well, I wouldn't be doing anything. Awareness would pick up on it.
Okay, so how does that happen?
I can't explain that. I don't know. How does,
But it does
how does
happen,
that?
right? You
I'm-
move from a state
Yeah, but
of,
I'm not trying to explain why awareness is or where it comes from, right? I'm just saying from my direct experience, this is how it appears.
but it does happen, right? It does go from a state of not being aware of the blue jay to being aware of it. That experience happens.
It's so the problem is the as long as I am not introduced into the idea that there is a blue jay singing, I won't make an action towards trying to manipulate or change my awareness in some sort of way in order to hear it singing. So the so then it would be somewhat of an invalid question. I wouldn't. Nothing would change because I wouldn't think I would have to change it.
It would be what happens is attention moves to hearing through the sense doors. So all you have is the sense doors, and so the awareness would move to the sense door of hearing.
Yeah.
And when that happens, the sound arises at the same time as awareness experiences it.
Right.
It doesn't arise until that happens.
Right.
Just like a needle on a record, no sound is being produced until the needle is touching the record. This is the same way as awareness touching the object or the sense door.
Sure. My point would be that whether you use the sense door of hearing or of sight, the information has to be transmitted first for you
That goes
receiving
into-
it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, it's cause and effect, right? The effect is your awareness, but the cause is the either light or sound waves that are being transmitted to you.
So to think that it exists before you're aware of it is a mental construct. It is your idea. You're thinking that it is true, that it is that way, is just an idea. It's a thought. The direct experience is different than the thought.
Do you think that it takes time for like a sound wave to move through space?
Does it take time? No.
No.
Time happens.
No, it's just it just is contacting awareness. It happens instantly.
Well, let's take a better example like thunder in the distance, right? The cause is the lightning, but it takes a few seconds if you're far away for the sound to get to you, right?
There's a measurement of
Again,
time, but that doesn't
that
mean
is
it doesn't take.
no. That's just again. That's just a thought. You're thinking that there's space between the sound by the event and the sound, but your experience is that the sound arises when it does. It's just your perception of the lightning bolt. There's a space between that and then the sound arises. So you're you're thinking it that it has to travel, or that there's a distance, but it really is just it contacting um, the sense.
This is going into non-duality then. So you don't think there's any distance? Are you there?
Yeah, I was really contemplating that question.
Oh, yeah. It's tough, right?
So, so the question is, is there
It's
a passage of time
right
between the lightning flash and
to to the eyes, to the perception of seeing. One could say that there is distance, or that it appears to be distance.
with that comparison between the lightning flash and the thunder?
Right.
And you perceiving it.
Yeah, the awareness that, like,
Well,
I've stood on
you
the
don't need
ground.
to involve yourself because you already hear the lightning flash you already see the lightning flash and you already hear the thunder. You don't need to involve yourself.
Well, she's speaking about awareness because that's where
Yeah,
Right.
which does involve
I'm
yourself.
putting myself is, yeah, this point of awareness.
Right. I guess. Okay.
So again, I'm not saying that this is like you all need to realize or be at this point, or that there is a point. That I'm just saying this is the way that makes, I guess, sense to me, or that I experience. I rely more on what my direct experience is, and that there can be thoughts like, oh, that it is sort of an illusion, that it appears to be that way, but it's more of direct experience. This is how it happens. This is how it occurs. This is how it unfolds.
Sure, it's just that your senses are limited. So if someone was standing right beneath the lightning bolt, in the same moment that you see it, they hear it, but you don't hear it for another few seconds. That doesn't. The fact that you aren't aware of it as quickly as they are doesn't mean that the sound itself doesn't come into existence until you're aware of it, because its existence isn't dependent on your own personal awareness.
I would, I guess, say that it does, because that person that's standing by closer to the lightning bolt,
Right. Because if it's
that's how it would occur for
if
him.
it's a
Yeah,
if it's
for
a competition of if it's a competition of reaction speed, then yes, of course it matters.
I'm just trying to use the time lapse to illustrate the point that they don't. I mean, all of existence, if it's duality, arises simultaneously, but that doesn't mean that sound doesn't exist until you hear it, because it isn't dependent on just you as a subjective singular. It's dependent on all of reality. So the clouds, quote unquote, hear it. The person standing below it hears it. The trees that don't have ears still experience the sound waves.
But you can't
You can't say that.
prove that. You
You
can't
can't
say
say
that
that.
that does exist. That's all just a thought and idea, because the only thing you have is your experience. That's it. That's it. That you
Well,
can't have something else, because those are all ideas and thoughts, and you say
yes, obviously
the
it could all
but you
be a matrix and it could all be made up. I mean, yeah, this is
Well, that's not the
epistemology
point here.
101. The only
You're
thing I
only
know for 100% certain is that I exist. I know.
right.
yeah. So all, like, I mean, if you want to boil it down, like, really, if you want me to boil it down, I have absolutely no idea what this experience is, what is happening, what's going on, why it is, how it is. I have no clue. I don't know any of that. All I know for sure is that there is an experience happening. That's it.
Yeah,
That's like,
so the reason I wanted to talk so much about epistemology before was that that's kind of just a given, and none of us can prove from any of our own perspective that that's not the case 100%. And so it becomes kind of like, yeah, nobody can argue against that. So let's just set it aside, and it's safe enough to assume that the rest of reality exists so that we can talk about it instead of constantly kind of falling back on, well, I don't know if any of this is real, because that's always going to be the case. Primary reality. Everything else is either subject to doubt or is an illusion.
and that's why I was sort of arguing that whole point of nothing exists except
I
what I'm
know,
aware
I
of.
know. It's just kind of like, okay, I agree, but let's just allow for that 2% of doubt and then just assume that the rest exists. It makes things
Sure, there
easier.
there's practical reasons why I would use the other information to help um, with my existence. But honestly, like 99% of it is unnecessary. Really, it is. Like, I just love to just be in the moment, be just not even really worried or concerned about other things
And
if
yeah.
it's not necessary.
And this is the closest that we can get to non-duality. I mean, it's not, I'm not convinced that it's true non-duality because you still are limited by your sense doors, but I think that when you meditate and you get to a state where you can experience reality without any labels, you don't see difference anymore. I would say that, it's not like time stops though, and it's not like you can experience anything beyond your sense doors. So that's why I don't think it's true non duality by itself. I just think that it's the closest that we can get to it.
Yeah, time becomes irrelevant because it's just filled with awareness. And so you're so um, engaged with just awareness that everything else just seems like a dream, sort of irrelevant. There is a place you can get with in meditation. I have experienced it directly for myself, and that is where even the experience of being aware disappears. But
Mm-hmm.
it's exactly the same as deep sleep. It's only that you don't actually fall asleep. That's not what happens. It is the experience of a momentary awareness shutting off and then turning back on. And so there's like some process that happens before that and then after that. And only after the fact you go, what was that? That was kind of crazy. And I didn't even have anybody point this out to me till like years later.
You mean, is it like a time skip, like you don't remember?
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly like a time skip. Exactly.
Glitch in the Matrix. The most I ever got was this place where I had total awareness without labeling or separating, so that all of the sense doors were open and perceiving. I like that word. I've been picking up that sense doors phrase. I really like that. And I was able to just experience like this endless stream of reality.
I know exactly what you're talking about. So I could try to describe it and then maybe you can confirm that maybe your experience was the same. The feeling was this one pointedness, that there was this single unending moment. And